What happened to me 3 years ago is hard for me to tell you and talk about. It has traumatized me and has left me a different person. So I will try my best to calmly and carefully explain my situation. So here I go. 3 years ago, I was asked if I can come and stay at my friend's house for a couple of weeks, just to watch their animals for them while they left. This family was a family that I was very close with and had grown up with for a very long time. They lived on the outskirts of a smaller town out in Arizona and had some goats and some dogs and some other miscellaneous livestock, like chickens. They were going on a 2-week stint across the U.S. somewhere, but I couldn't really bother to remember. It's kind of irrelevant. I was in between jobs at this time, pretty rinky-dink ones, and they were going to pay me a pretty penny for the 2 weeks that I was planning to stay out at their house. So, of course, I accepted the offer. They live about an hour outside of a small town in Arizona that I can't remember the name of. I just know it's a couple of hours outside of Tucson, but they have their own piece of property with a small stable-like structure that they have built, and they house other livestock in. Goats primarily. Dogs and such, but they don't have any horses or cattle, which I guess is uncommon. To keep their names covered, I'll refer to them as Jack and Danielle. They were both in their later 30s. My family had grown up close with them for quite some time, until they moved outside of Tucson, to where I can only imagine that they still are today, if that is where they are. I'll explain that in a minute. They knew I was out of work and looking for a decent paycheck, so they offered me a 2-week job of looking after their house and their pets for a 2-week stay at their home. But my parents and I had to get me out there, so they bought me a Greyhound ticket. I was only 18 at the time. To my knowledge, Danielle could not conceive, so the only real children they had were their dogs and goats, which was fine by me. It meant less I had to babysit on top of what I was doing, and I figured I could use the time at their place to kind of just chill out and enjoy the hot weather and de-stem from my life here. Little did I know it was going to turn into what it did. So, I got a ticket out there, and I met Jack in Tucson, where he picked me up from the bus stop. I grew up in Southern Cali, along with Jack and Danielle for most of my life, so I was already accustomed to the stifling heat. But I feel like Arizona brought a whole new level. On the car ride out there, he's explaining to me how beautiful it is and how I'm going to have a great time for these next 2 weeks, and hopefully, I won't be too bored. Arriving on the property was the first real time I even got to see their house. It was much larger than I imagined it. Jack worked a very high-paying job, and Danielle operated a very successful at-home business making clothing, so they were not short for good money. They both took me on a mini tour of the property, where I was able to see their outside shed they built, and see a beautiful handcrafted stable that they made for their goats and dogs. Even though the dogs were so attached to Danielle and Jack, they never slept in it. They primarily slept inside. Hey, whatever, right? It was their fur babies after all. They had a total of 6 goats and 4 dogs and about a dozen chickens. They had a Labrador retriever named Missy. They had a black lab named Buddy. And then 2 blue heelers that were rescued were also sisters that came from the same puppy litter. Their names were Misha and Mega. The goats all had very similar names, kind of reminding me of the dwarfs in the Lord of the Rings book. They briefly explained to me how to take care of them, when to feed them, etc. It wasn't really hard to do. If anybody ever owns livestock, then they would probably know what I'm talking about. I asked them if there was any problems that ever arose. Predators, an animal going into labor that I wouldn't know what to do. They laughed and eased my thoughts, and told me I was overthinking it, that they hadn't had any problems like that, and I should be fine. I was probably just nervous. Little did I know that my life during the stay would change forever, and would of course involve sectors of the government I couldn't dare dream of. But again, I'll get on to that. Thankfully, the upkeep was very minimal, and after that, we went inside and hung out till the evening time, when it was time for them to go and head to the airport to catch their flight. We had a good homemade dinner, and a good talk, and they said their goodbyes. The 4 dogs were pretty in and out of the house. I knew they would keep me good company. I had Jack and Danielle's number, so if I needed anything, I would just be able to reach out to them first. We finally said our goodbyes, and then that was it. They headed off, and I would not see them again till the following Saturday after the next. It was Friday, and they were set to arrive back the Saturday morning after the next. 2 weeks exactly from the following morning. So more like 2 weeks and a half a day. Surprisingly, Jack and Danielle had pretty good internet out where they were, considering it was kind of just the middle of nowhere. There wasn't much around. Oh, and if you consider the desert beautiful, then you would be in heaven here. The next few days would prove fairly uneventful, and nothing really happened. I would go outside periodically and spend some time with the goats and play with the dogs. Other times I would watch TV, or play on my phone or what have you, even dinking around on YouTube. They had a really nice guest room with a very expensive mattress, so to say I slept like a baby is a complete understatement. It was either on the third or fourth day, I can't remember. I woke up in the middle of the night to some loud banging and noise outside of the stable, and the goats screaming. I figured one of the dogs slipped out and was causing a ruckus, so I was already starting to get irritated because I was awakened from my perfect slumber. Groggy and angry, and getting up out of bed, I was getting ready to get out there and yell at the dogs for getting out of the stable, and I made it to the back door and opened it. Stepping out and walking to the stable, I continued to hear a bunch of commotion. I had a flashlight with me, so I'm shining it, and I get to the small stable door, and before I can open it, I hear something big trail off in the night behind the stables. I open the door, revealing all goats that were visibly fine, but they seemed incredibly shaken. I remember thinking, what was that? What on earth is going on? I was spooked, but my mind made excuses like it was probably a big coyote or something. The whole thing just gave me the heebie-jeebies. It felt wrong. After a few minutes of trying to calm them down, and myself, I decided it was time to go back to bed. Upon stepping back in the house, I see the 4 dogs passed out on the floor by the kitchen snoring. Yikes. I don't know how I missed that. I'm not really sure what happened there. Hopefully I don't have to deal with setting up traps to catch a coyote or something. And besides, I could have sworn I set the dogs in the stable. Maybe it will resolve itself, I thought. I went and laid back down, taking me probably an hour or 2 to finally fall back asleep. I was awakened by Missy slobbering all over my face that morning. The same next day, I went out to go check on the goats, which they seemed to be fine now, after their little strange extravaganza from last night. Now that it wasn't pitch black, I decided to walk on the back side of the stable, where I'd heard whatever it was jumped out and take off into the desert night. I could see that a piece of the stable had a broken opening. This left about a 3-foot hole in the bottom, and that a small animal could easily fit in. I couldn't tell if it had been like that way for a while, or something from the outside had broken in. My first instinct was to let Jack and Danielle know that we might have a coyote problem. I tried calling both their phones, but they were either off or no service. I got a call back from them later in the day, asking if everything was okay, and I briefly told them about what had happened and my findings. Jack instructed me to not hesitate to pull out his rifle that he had stored away, if I needed to, and they had issues with coyotes in the last few years, but not any time recent. I kinda just said okay, sounds good. But once I got off the phone, I was freaking out. I'm just a kid from South California. I never even held a gun before, let alone shoot one off. I didn't even know how to load it. I can only hope that more problems didn't arise. A couple more nights came and went, and things seemed calm again. On one of the following nights, I was jolted awake by a slamming on the window, and when I turned, I nearly fell out of the bed. Glaring at me from the window was this hideous face you'd see out of a video game. If I were to give you a description, it looked just like the Faulkner from Skyrim, except it had large black eyes and long jagged teeth. I started screaming and ran out of the room. I don't know why it was slamming on the window. I guess it was trying to get in. My running into the living room freaked out the dogs and woke them up, and they started barking and going into a frenzy. I quickly grabbed a long knife from the kitchen and crouched down behind the counters and waited for the thing to get into the house. All the while, The dogs were going crazy. After sitting there for a couple of moments, I realized I had the advantage because I had 4 hungry dogs with me, or so I thought. I must have forgot to feed them dinner. I figured they would take quick work of whatever this was, so I quickly ran over to the sliding door, opened it, and let all 4 dogs out while they went haywire. I waited there by the sliding door for a few moments until they came back, but they didn't seem bothered anymore. I mean, really bothered at all. If anything, I think a few of them had used that opportunity to use the bathroom, but they didn't act like anything had been out of place. I was still freaked the hell out, so I locked up everything and went to lay down on the kitchen floor beside the cabinets with a knife in hand. I don't know what time I fell asleep. At this point, sleeping in the guest bedroom was now completely out of the question. The next morning, I had a terrible feeling in my gut. How on earth am I going to call Jack and tell him what happened? He's not going to believe me. Believe that some psycho in some Halloween mask tried to break into the house, if that is what even happened. Maybe I dreamt it. I don't know. Maybe I was going crazy. I decided that I was probably going stir crazy and was mentally losing it, so I decided to spend most of the day outside in hopes that the sun would help alleviate that. I spent some time looking around but didn't see anything that looked out of place. I honestly believed I was beginning to lose it. That night, I decided that it would be safe if I slept in the living room with the dogs around me and a knife on the table next to me, just in case anything happened. Like clockwork, I woke up again to the sound of goats going crazy in the stable, and like a soldier being woken up by combat, without thinking, I sat up to grab my knife and ran towards the sliding glass door with my flashlight. The dogs that too were awakened were going crazy, so I figured if we're all going out there, we'd be able to put a stop to whatever was causing havoc in the stable. This is where things turn from normal to absolute insanity, and I have to remind myself that yes, I was in reality when this happened. Me and the dogs run to the stable door, and there is so much noise going on. Before I go on to where I open the door, I could hear the goats screaming and going crazy, more intensely than they were before, of the previous night. The dogs around me are barking and going nuts, but I also heard some unknown noises along with all the other noise, hissing, and some sort of unknown animal screeching noise. I fling open the small stable door and shine my flashlight, and this is where my reality turned into that of a Hollywood horror movie. 5 goats remained in the spots they've always been, freaked out, and one of them was on the ground, dead. Its throat had been torn out and was being eaten on. However, it wasn't as simple as that, as much as I would like it to. When I shined my light, 2 unknown creatures looked to be in a brawl. One creature I saw had blood all over its face, and I immediately recognized it to be the same creature that had slammed on the guest bedroom window the other night. It was shorter than I expected, and kind of weird looking, almost alien-like, but terrifyingly humanoid, with a large head and long spindly claws and fingers. What terrified me even more was the other creature that it was fighting against. It looked like a human, and a dinosaur had a baby. It was very reptile-like, almost kind of like a dinosaur, I guess I would say. It had long black claws and jagged-like reptile teeth, and it was fighting the other animal. It also had piercing yellow eyes that seemed to glow. Both of these creatures dwarfed the goats around them, and the dogs that surrounded me straight up abandoned me and fled whining back to the house, just at the sight alone. I honestly feel like in that moment, I went into total shock and stood there paralyzed. This reptile creature pinned down the other creature, whatever it was, and tore a large piece of meat off of its side, where that creature screamed the most inhuman scream I've ever heard. They somehow didn't even notice me, or seem to care I was shining the light right on them, if this was going on. As it tore the chunk of meat off, blood splattered, and it pushed itself up and tore through the back of the stable, breaking much more of the wood off and ripping open the board, while this reptilian creature chased after it. Both creatures running on all fours with blood everywhere. Not only was the goat in front of me dead, with its throat torn out, but I also noticed that there was this weird slimy substance all over the inside of the stable. It's kinda like saliva-y, but it was different. It had a dark color to it and was very thick, kinda like a goop. Then there was the blood from whatever these two creatures were fighting against. I don't think I really had time to process what reality was, honestly. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, and all I could do was phone the police, and told them creatures were trying to break in and kill my goats. Even the operator was acting kind of strange about what I'd like to do. She kept saying, "What do you mean creatures?" I just kept saying, "I need an officer here now. I need an officer here now." About 12 minutes later, as I'm pacing around the front, trying to process whatever my reality now was, as an officer shows up outside the house. He was a very nice older gentleman who had heard what I had to say and then went back there to go check it out for himself. He comes back a few minutes later, and he asked that I call the owners, Jack and Danielle, and let them know that they were needed back here as soon as they could. The officer seriously explained to me, after observing everything that happened, that this was far more serious than he initially thought, whatever that means. He left and kept things very vague. He really didn't give me any information. I immediately called Jack and Danielle, waking them up in the middle of the night, freaking out, telling them exactly what I saw that happened. They both went quiet. I was on speakerphone, so I heard both their reactions. They didn't say much, which kind of freaked me out even more. Jack just said he'll be there first thing in the morning, and he'll get a flight as soon as he could. I head inside the rest of the night with a knife in my hand, and the dogs, and not knowing what the hell I just saw, or if I was in some joke or prank show, or possibly a horror movie. Maybe somewhere along the way, somebody slipped me some LSD, and this was all just a bad trip. I honestly believe I was just in total shock, and that I couldn't fully process what was going on. For the next period of time, I want to say an hour, I sat there on the kitchen floor with 2 knives in my hand, waiting, rocking back and forth. I don't think I fell asleep, but felt extremely detached from reality. I heard a knock at the door. At this point, it's early on in the morning, still dark out. I put the knives down and answered it. It was several investigators who were asking me a bazillion questions. Their entire demeanor was hostile. They even looked funny. They reminded me of Secret Service agents. There was probably about 12 of them with large black SUVs, and they were all standing out in front, with several of them with strange equipment I have never seen before, heading towards where the stable had been, or where the stable was. They told me to step out of the house, and they detained me immediately and put me inside their SUV for the time being. I don't know how long I spent in the back of an SUV, but after some time, 4 of them climbed in the back and then blindfolded me. We drove for what felt like hours and hours until we came to a stop. I was led by force out of the vehicle into this strange building, down several flights of stairs, until they sat me down into this large room. They took my blindfold off and my cuffs. I looked like I was in what appeared to be a large room that you would see in police stations used for questioning, except this was double the size and a little bit more dangerous looking. There were 2 of the same agents standing there at the door, guarding, when another agent came through. At this point, I was bawling, terrified, sleep deprived. I had no idea what was going on. Nobody was telling me anything. I didn't know where I was. I didn't even know if I was safe or who these people were. The man who sat directly at the table across from me appeared to be what I would call very polished. He looked artificial, if that makes sense. Like his skin didn't look right. I don't know if that means anything. He remained very mono-expressive and monotone. He showed zero emotion in his face or voice. He began by asking me some bizarre questions. Some I can't fully remember, but others I do remember. Like, what did you do when you saw the unknown animal observing you through the window a few nights ago? Things like that. I would freak and ask them how they knew these things, but he remained stern and didn't answer any of my questions. He only repeated his questions until I gave him an answer. After some back and forth, he got up quietly without saying a word and left the room. I sat there for probably God knows how long, and then he came back in the room again and sat down. He briefly told me that I'm never allowed to talk to anybody about my time at that location. what I saw or did, and I am never to speak to Jack and Danielle again. He reiterated that there would be serious repercussions if I denied those commands. I told him where to go and how to get there, and for the first time in our conversation, he gave a brief smirk and calmly said, "So be it," and got up and left. 2 men entered the room, looking like every other strange service agent person, and held me down and injected some strange fluid into my neck. No matter how hard I fought, they seemed to have an iron grip over me, like it was unnatural. I couldn't fight back. I lost consciousness quickly. The next thing I know, I wake up in a hospital bed, 4 days later in Southern California, only miles out from where I live with my parents at my bedside. I began screaming, crying, freaking out, screaming so loud that the doctors and nurses come rushing in to find out what's wrong. I began screaming that I needed to talk to Jack and Danielle. My parents just gave me the grimmest look, while the doctors and nurses were trying to calm me down. My dad sat down on the bed, looked off into space, and sighed. He said, "Son, nobody has been able to get a hold of either of them. It's been 4 days now. Nobody knows what happened. They've been reported missing, and there's already a missing persons report for each." I screamed more and more and questioned how I got here. What happened? I was told that I was found lying on the side of a highway nearly 12 miles from this hospital and was taken here when someone found me. I couldn't stop crying. I was literally going insane. I remembered everything. As soon as things became calmer, the doctors and nurses left the room and gave my parents and I our privacy. I told them everything that had happened while I was there, and that I was taken by these strange men. They just looked at me and told me they're going to let me rest. I don't think they believed me. Surprisingly, they didn't even ask how I ended up 12 miles out on the middle of a highway being picked up by somebody. I don't know why or how. Fast forward in time until right now, where I moved out shortly after coming home from the hospital. I moved out with some friends and moved states away where I could work a small job. I haven't been mentally right since this traumatic event occurred. It's really screwed me up emotionally. I still have never talked to Jack or Danielle since this occurred, and don't know what became of them. I tried sending them handwritten letters to their address, only to get my mail sent back to me, saying that address doesn't exist. I've tried calling them, but the numbers nothing exist. I've had an increasingly difficult time with life as of late, and have even contemplated suicide. Something happened that I wasn't supposed to see or be a part of. Something that involved the government. I feel like I'm in some weird episode of X-Files or something. More importantly, I want to know what happened to Jack and Danielle. The last time I spoke to them was over the phone that night, and that was it. I wonder what happened to them, if they ever made it back. I'm sorry this is so long, but I'm so desperate to reach out for help. I've already reached out to multiple people, groups, individuals, all telling my story, and nobody is taking me seriously, even as big as a risk as I am taking. I don't know what else much to do. I want to know what happened, what I saw, and what that had to do with me being detained and questioned. Who were the people that detained me? Why was I being questioned? Where is Jack and Danielle? I need some answers. For now, I'm going to try and remain sane, even in this quarantine where life is even more uncertain. I grew up in California. In my 20s, I moved out to a place in rural Idaho where my girlfriend's family lived. I only lived out there with her and them for about 6 years before her and I split up. Actually, it was a really rough breakup, and when people always talk about the one that got away, well, that was her. However, I'm not here to bore you with lost romance. I wanted to write to you because of the things that I saw while I lived with her family and her during that time. To protect her family, because I still respect and built those relationships, I'm going to keep where they lived privately. I can tell you it was southern Idaho, and it was a very, very rural area. The Snake River wasn't extremely far away. There's some hints. Now, nearby where her parents lived was a medium-sized farm. Maybe not even a farm, but I know for certain that they raised livestock. I can't remember if I saw many cows, but I do remember seeing a ton of goats and pigs, so who knows what kind of operation they were running. Never saw the people, nor did I meet them. This is relevant and important at the time. I was working at security at this nearby company, doing the night shift gig. Sometimes I wouldn't be there till 11 p.m. Other nights it was 2 a.m. My schedule varied on and off. There were a couple of nights that I remember seeing this tall, super skinny dog walking on two legs coming out of this old fence from that farm with a dead pig or goat in its arms. It creeped me right out. The first time I only ever saw it from the back when my headlights hit it. As soon as they did, it took off even faster into the woods nearby, but I saw the dead pig it was carrying. First time I said a few choice words, and I didn't know what kind of animal it was. It sure was freaky looking. I don't know what kind of animals lived out here. I don't think I ever really once thought about werewolves or Bigfoot or any of that. I didn't believe in that stuff. I'm also not a country boy, so the wild is an unknown area for me. I just stick to what I know. And I tell you, I have never seen such a slender dog-like animal walking on two legs like that. It was also very tall. The first thing I noticed was the cropped ears. For the first second, it honestly looked like how a dog does when it stands up and puts its two front paws on you. Same tapered waist and hocks like a dog. But this thing was walking and then running on two legs, like it was comfortable doing so. It strongly resembled a German Shepherd from behind, but it was a dark brown color, just from what I saw. The second time I saw it was shortly after the first, and it was facing me this time, going towards the area that I saw it last time. This time it was also empty-handed. That's when I saw it from the front, and when I say freaky looking, I mean freaky looking. It was very lanky, skinny, but didn't look starving. Also not very muscular at all either, but fairly lean. It had extremely long arms and legs, and a very unnaturally large head. It was again walking on two legs. I never once thought werewolf, because it didn't resemble a werewolf or anything that I'd ever seen. Just a freak of nature. My head spun around again when my headlights hit it. I immediately recognized it as the creature that I had seen previously. It had a very angry, pissed-off look on its face. Its face was stuck in a snarl position, revealing its massive canine fangs that were protruding down like a saber-toothed cat. Didn't get to look at the face much, because my lights were only on it for a few seconds as I passed by, and it paid no attention to me or my vehicle. It was clearly on a mission to get to wherever it was going. It was walking just like a man though. Super freaky like I said. Gave me the creeps. I didn't see it again after that for a while. Not until the following summer, where I was still working the same job and the same varied schedule. I saw it a few more times that same year, all throughout the summer and fall. I never saw it facing me like I did that one time, but it was without a doubt the same animal. There's no mistaking it. Nothing looks like that animal did, nor is tall or walks on two legs like that. Each time I saw it, the thing either had a dead pig in its arms or a dead goat. One time, it had a goat's body with no head, and there was dried blood all over. I wouldn't see it every night, but just here and there. It really freaked me out enough that eventually I would start to think about it and hope not to see it again. I worked security at that job for a total of 2 years, and then got a different job with a totally different company on the opposite side of town, resulting in me never driving around that road again. I never told my girlfriend at the time or her family about what I saw during my time there as a security guy. I spent some time years back in my small travel trailer, being out on the road, enjoying seclusion away from people and things. Since I primarily work from home, and only really need the internet a couple of days a week, I spent most of my time in the middle of nowhere, enjoying the solace of the wilderness around me. At night, I would start fires, have a beer or two, and crash out in my small bed in my trailer. Because of the experiences I had, on 2 separate occasions, I've certainly slowed down on my camp rendezvousing for the time being, and just learned to settle with a piece of property to call my own. Thankfully, I have not dealt with anything as I did in my trailer here, which is nice. On 2 separate occasions, I was parked at different national parks, one in Oklahoma, the other in Kansas. Both times I heard the same really low rumbling noise. It was like a growling outside of my trailer late at night. My trailer is very small, so there ain't much to protect me if, say, a bear wanted to come and charge me and eat my face off. I didn't have any real forms of protection on me either, other than a large hunting knife. Not near enough to ward away any serious predator or threat. Stupid me, I know. These low rumblings would grow in volume and then decrease in volume over and over. The intervals were random, and they'd be going on all throughout the night, all around my trailer. It sounded like a big wolf, but it was also so loud and powerful that you could feel the bass vibrations through your body. Whatever was making those growling sounds had to possess a massive set of lungs on them and be far larger than any bear. It made me get out of there real fast. The second time it happened, I didn't waste any time. I heard that same growling noise in the middle of the night, and man, I got up out of my sleeping bag and just ripped it out right out of there. I don't know what kind of animal it came from, and frankly, I didn't care long enough to stick around. What I do know is that of all the animals it could have been, a bear and mountain lion do not exhibit those behaviors like that. The first night, this animal stuck around most of the night and circled my trailer. I'm certain wolves don't even behave this way. Besides, it was so large, the only thing I could think of that would have given it justice would have been a bear. Again, bears don't behave like this either. The energy I felt was extremely hostile, as if I had encroached on this thing's home. If you're ever out touring the wild or national parks of states, be careful where you park your camper for the night. There are things that you don't want to encounter in the dark. This story involves a bit of tragedy, so I'll just come out and say it. First, I was never close at all with my grandfather. He was a very wicked man to me and my family growing up. Extremely cold, so we never had a close relationship. He was extremely verbally and physically abusive to my mother growing up. So, again, no real relationship ties or anything there. Just this last month, we were alerted by another family member that a wild dog broke into his house, and he apparently died of a heart attack. When police showed up at the house, there was definitive signs and evidence to support the break-in of a large unknown animal. Everything pointed to a canine. My grandfather was found on the living room floor, dead. He had died with a horrified expression on his face, and it was later revealed that he passed away from cardiac arrest. A family member found him and called the police, and they investigated. My family and I didn't find any of this out till recently, when the family member who discovered him called us to tell us personally. He lives in an entirely different state, so again, we have no real ties with him, nor have we seen him in some time. I do know that he lives alone in a small house with no neighbors. I don't know where he lives geographically speaking, but I know it's not in town. Anyway, this family member told us that whatever broke in broke down the side to his house, the back door, I guess, into the kitchen. It had been ripped off or broken off entirely off its hinges, and large muddied canine-like tracks and marks were all over the kitchen and floor. Whatever dog or animal this was never touched any portion of the house besides the kitchen and dining room areas. It also never touched my grandfather or touched him when he was deceased. While my family, who was close with him, is dealing with the mourning, the thoughts of a dogman being the only one responsible is the thing that's really sending chills down my spine and haunting my thoughts. I'm obsessed with cryptids and channels like yours, so as soon as this happened, I wanted to get your opinion on what you think. The family member who told us called my mother and told her and then she relayed the info to me. None of my family knows or really believes in any of that stuff, but when I was told all of this, it rang a huge bell, a huge red flag. It screams Dogman. I believe a Dogman killed him, broke into his house, and scared him so bad he had a heart attack. I've listened to plenty of Vic Hundiff's Dogman encounters, and yours, so I know a Dogman encounter when I hear one. I'm still trying to register the craziness of this. I never thought it would happen to my family out of everybody. I'm almost certain this was Dogman related. I mean, really, what large canine-like animal breaks into a house with as much force as this did and not attack my grandfather? What kind of canine rips the back door off a house completely off its hinges? There's no bear, no wolf, no animal that can possess that kind of human-like intelligence or strength. Maybe as time goes on, I can get some more answers for you, but for now, I can at least relay this info to you. Wish me luck as I go and dig for what else more I can find. I'll let you know when I do. I know there is in fact animals that we don't know about that live among us without us ever knowing their existence. Back in the 90s, when I was going down a long, steep cliff in a ravine in a smaller canyon, I came across a nest of something large. I'll spare you the boring details about my background, but I was traveling down the steep ravine in Northern California on a personal expedition I was doing. I did this kind of stuff all the time, so I knew how to go about it. I came across a small drop-off where I could catch my footing and could also catch my breath. If you walked about 10 feet to your right, it led to this tiny outcropping underneath the rock. From the top of the canyon, or where the cliff that I came from was, you would never be able to even see it because it's almost like looking directly down. It was directly under this outcropping that I saw this giant, well, what I would describe as nest. It looked like a bunch of old branches and other miscellaneous brush that was neatly placed in a large area, big enough for a grizzly bear to sleep in. My mind immediately went to bears, but I know bears don't make nests like this. They also usually make dens in caves, and this was in May. Bears would be out and about in the spring, so that could have been it. Also, there's no way a bear would be able to climb down this steep of a cliff and have no reason for a bear to make a den in this small outcropping. The only thing that makes sense in my mind, which I know sounds insane, is a pterodactyl. It definitely had to be something that can fly, but the nest just didn't make sense. It was so incredibly large that no known bird should live in it. I've been out in the wild enough, and I've seen hawks, falcons, eagles, and other large birds of prey, like even vultures, and I've seen the nests these things make. This nest, however, trumped all of them in size. It was very discernible as some sort of bird nest. Being very intrigued, I took my time and sought after any clues I could find. Any old eggshell fragments or possibly bones. Buried underneath the brush, I found a couple of old stag bones and a couple of doe skulls. There were a few femur bones here and there, and a few possible rib bones that came from either a cow or a deer, judging by the shape and size. I don't know about you, but I have no idea what birds eat on the remains of a cow or deer. I knew I was dealing with some sort of bird of prey, and after I found those bones, which looked to be very old by the way, maybe it wasn't a good idea that I stuck around as long as I did. I felt like I had a false sense of comfort, because the nest to me felt like it had been abandoned. There is some overgrowth coming from the sides, and brush and branches that the nest was made out of looked unkempt and messed up, and hadn't been laid in or laid on in some time. Then it dawned on me that I believe I discovered a nest of some unknown, large bird of prey. I don't know what kind, and I would certainly not want to meet it, but that's just what I believe. Again, I firmly believe that this is the nest that was no longer in use, but I didn't feel like it was appropriate to stick around longer, just in case I was wrong. With the environment around it, where the nest is and was, it created the perfect getaway hiding spot for whatever large bird made this nest here. No predators or any egg thieves would be able to reach it, and stayed far out of the eyesight or earsight of anyone happening to wander through the area. Had I not glanced over when I caught my footing, I would have gone right past it down the ravine wall. During my time of expeditions and climbing up and down cliffs, I have found a lot of cool stuff, and this one is hands down the best one. Since you seem to be the expert on cryptids and possible unknown animals, you might have some insight as to what exactly I stumbled upon. I'm going to start this off and let you know that I'm not crazy. I know what I saw. There's no way anybody could hallucinate such a thing. I've already gotten ample disbelief from friends and family who chose not to believe my story, and I guess I can't blame them, having never seen what I did. That's okay though. I just accept that there's more out there than we know, and it's funny. I used to think that we've explored everything there is to explore on this planet, but I guess I was wrong. There are certain creatures that are really good at hiding, because otherwise we would all know about them by now, right? Almost 6 years ago, I was spending some time out in the bayous of Louisiana and western Florida, scouting out some great places to fish. I do all of my adventures soloing. I'm just a very independent person, and I like the solace of being alone. I guess in this case, it worked out against me, because had I had a witness with me, I feel like I would have been that much more credible. Oh well. I reached an open spot that was right near the ocean. The Gulf, actually. It was still very swampy, but you can kind of see the ocean from where I was. It was a spot where the swamp actually kind of opened up inland. I had hiked off the road for quite a few miles in this dense swamp. I didn't have any of my equipment with me, because I was just getting out of location, like I said, just seeing what was around the area. For those that aren't aware of the environment here, it's humid as hell, with alligators and insects everywhere. It can be extremely treacherous if you don't know your environment, and you become too prideful and arrogant. I was under the impression already that I was not in my safe zone, and I needed to tread very lightly. There's also poisonous snakes and other things out here that can kill you or hurt you. I guess you can say that is part of the thrill. Once I reached the open area that the swamp came in inland, I noticed there were quite a few alligators in the water, and a few hanging out on the embankment across from the swamp that I was at. I had to be extremely careful at traversing and treading where I was going. I didn't plan on going into the water at all, even if it only was knee-deep. I wasn't risking anything. I go past my side of the embankment and start to head towards the innermost part of the swamp that goes back into the direction north. As I'm heading in that direction towards the swamp, I hear a huge sound behind me, probably about 30 yards away. Whatever it was had to have been large, because I hear this large force coming down from the sky. It was the sound of wind being moved. It stopped me in my tracks, and I turned. This is what I saw, and I kid you not, I am not crazy. Plain as day, this massive bird, I don't know what you would call it, because I only saw it for about a second or two before it descended and ascended again. From the glimpse I got, it kind of looked like an eagle, but it was all black with white markings along its wings and back that I had never seen before. That's not what shook me. It was the sheer size and what it did that took my breath away. The wingspan on this monster had to have been easily 20 feet in length if it was standing on the ground, and I'm probably being conservative. This bird was probably 10 to 12 feet tall if standing. I mean it when I said this was a massive animal. It was so large that as it descended out into the sky, it made an audible noise. I turned and saw it descending right as I was about to go to the ground, and then I realized it was doing something. It had its sights set on this large alligator that was sitting right there on the embankment, on the opposite side that I was, near a large tree. It descended, and with its massive talons, grabbed this alligator in one swift motion, picked it up with its talons, and flew off, just like that. It was like watching a hawk grab a field mouse and then take off. It was nothing to this bird, or whatever it was. It didn't even look like the alligator that got grabbed had even any time to react. In just 1 second, it got scooped up and then gone. To give you some more detail about the environment, even though it was all bog and swamp, there was enough sky opening in this part of the swamp that the bird was easily able to navigate down from the sky into. It wasn't so thick and covered that it made it impossible or tough for this bird to fly out of. It was very open, with lots of sun coming through. The bird itself didn't make any noise like squawks or screams, kind of like what you'd expect, but it was moving so much faster, and so much so that it was audible. It's kind of like if you take a stick and start waving it really fast, you'll start hearing that whipping sound in the air. That's just from you moving around. It was kind of the same thing, if that makes any sense. It all happened so fast that I nearly soiled my pants as this happened. And that moment, I gave up any and all hope that I would find any remote fishing spot safely, and took off quickly back to my truck, parked a couple of miles in the direction I was heading. It really did terrify me, and it kind of stopped my adventuring out in places that I don't necessarily know too well. I don't know what it was. I don't know what kind of birds naturally live out in the swamp. Whatever this was, though, took down an alligator like it was nothing. And let me clarify this with you. The alligator that it grabbed wasn't a small 3-foot gator. This was a decent-sized 6 to 7 foot length adult alligator. I don't know if you'll believe my story, and I was even hesitant to write this up and send it to you, but I figured it's worth a shot. Sometimes I feel like it's a burden to keep this on me and not tell anybody about it. I've asked friends and family if they know of any large birds that live out in the swamps, or any birds that eat alligators, and I'm just responded to with strange looks. I still feel uncomfortable telling my story to people, in fear of rejection. I think I'll get over it eventually, and I know for me, typing this out to you and processing what happened is helping me work through it. It was just such a surreal experience. I don't think I'll ever fully process it all. I have been in a long-distance relationship with my girlfriend for a couple of years now, and every summer and winter break, I'm able to go travel and see her. This encounter happened about 2 years ago at my girlfriend's house. I should mention that my girlfriend lives on the outskirts of her city in Mexico, where houses are around 200 to 300 yards apart and surrounded by dense woods. Usually, days and nights there go about peacefully, accompanied by the sound of woods and the occasional car passing by from others who live nearby. I had always considered her place to be perfect just to be able to spend time outdoors, until this occasion. Honestly, I don't think I have ever been this scared in my life. This sighting will be carved in my mind forever. On a chilly night of December, I was at my girlfriend's house, and I had planned to spend the night with her since she would have been by herself that day. Her mom was out of town, and she didn't want to stay by herself either. We were having dinner at the kitchen at around 8 p.m. We chatted about activities that we could do tomorrow, tasks her mom asked her to do, how much we missed each other, among others. After about an hour of conversation and laughs, we decided to go into the living room and cuddle on the couch, watching TV. We both got up and put the dishes in the sink. She went into her bedroom, and I went outside to the bathroom. The house layout consisted of a long corridor that connected pretty much every room in the house, and a back door at the end of the corridor, which led to the patio. The patio was open, full of trees, plants, and the only thing separating the patio from the woods was a fence made up of stones and barbed wire that stood at around 1 meter tall. Halfway down the patio, there was the bathroom, being lit by a single and weak light bulb. So if anybody wanted to go, they had to walk outside, even if it had to be in the middle of the night. I'm not coming here at night, I thought. I remember when I opened the back door and stepped into the patio, a cold breeze stroked my face and sent shivers across my back. So, I hurried to go back as quickly as possible because, to be honest, I was a little spooked going outside in the darkness, knowing that the woods were pretty much a few steps away. I finished doing my business, washed my hands, and started walking back, being careful not to trip on something because the light bulb was almost non-existent. I was about halfway when I heard a noise to my left, like someone stepping on a branch and breaking it. I stopped and quickly turned, trying to see what made the noise, but I could only see a portion of the fence and nothing but darkness beyond that. However, I had this weird feeling that someone or something was watching me, something on the other side of the fence. I stood there in silence for around 30 seconds, listening to the surroundings, only to notice the crickets had stopped chirping. I got a bit freaked out because I knew for sure they were chirping when I first got out. I was somewhat scared to move, but I did anyway, almost running to get inside as soon as possible. When I returned, I went to my girlfriend, who was already in the living room, laying down on the couch with a blanket on top. She noticed I was a bit agitated and asked me what was wrong. "Your patio is scary," I jokingly said, not wanting to tell her what I felt, because she hates anything that has to do with horror or scary stuff. I decided to brush it off, so I ran around the couch and sat at the other end of it, putting my girlfriend's legs on my lap, asking what she was watching on the TV. I turned to my right and noticed there was a huge window on one side of the wall that gave me a perfect view of the patio. I didn't see it before because it was next to a cabinet, being covered on the way into the living room. Now that I knew about it, I kept turning to see outside, still thinking how scary it looked. As we were watching a boring documentary, I took off my girlfriend's socks and started to rub her feet below the blanket. After all, it was a chilly night, and her feet were cold. We didn't have any conversation. I was getting sleepy, but after around 20 minutes, I started hearing noises outside, noises that seemed to be coming from the patio. I grabbed the controller and muted the TV, just to make sure I was hearing right, and I was. It sounded like tiny twigs breaking and grass being brushed. I quickly turned to my right to see outside the window, but I could only see the plants and part of the trunk from a big tree. The noise, although faint, stopped for a few seconds, resumed a few moments later, and stopped again. I stood frozen, watching outside the window, almost as if waiting for a thing to appear. "What is that noise?" I whispered to my girlfriend. But after I did not get a reply, I turned around and stood up a little to see if she had her eyes closed and had fallen asleep. I was a bit freaked out, but I chose to believe it was probably a coyote or some other animal that lurks around in the woods at night. I kept watching the TV muted, waiting for the noise to start again, but after a while, I realized it had stopped. I turned around one more time to see outside the window, and I felt my heart sink into my stomach. The first thing I noticed when I looked outside that time was a faint image of a gray, pale, and tall humanoid figure, peeking from one side of the big tree trunk, staring right back at me. I suddenly froze in fear, not wanting to even slightly move or breathe. I watched this thing as it watched me, even though I couldn't see its eyes because of the poor lighting. But I knew it was watching me. I knew it was aware of me. I somehow felt it. The creature was, like I said, pale, really pale. I could see the contrast between its skin and the bark of the tree. The creature was very thin, had skinny shoulders and torso, as well as an elongated neck. It looked like it was around 6 or 7 feet tall. Unfortunately, or should I say fortunately, I cannot distinguish in detail any facial features just because of how dark it was. But I could perfectly picture in my head the shadowy areas around where eyes would be for a person, and another one where the mouth would be. It was sort of grinning. At this point, I was trembling a little, and I wanted to let my girlfriend know what I was witnessing, but I didn't want to move a muscle or break eye contact with this thing. I felt like I needed to remain still or play dead to lose its attention. But no, the creature kept staring at me, not moving an inch, like it was trying to do the same. Then, to turn things worse, the creature started to make an echoey clicking noise, kind of like a frog but slower, and I noticed it begin to turn its head to left side and turned back to look at me really fast. I don't know what to think anymore. All I wanted was my girlfriend to wake up, to prove to me that this thing was real. I began whispering her name in between my teeth and mouth, not even wanting to move my jaw, but she wouldn't wake up. The thing kept doing the same, turning its head to the left and back to me really fast. The creature crouched, kind of like when big predator cats are hunting and lay low, preparing to attack. I whispered. I know, stupid. I didn't even think through the fact that if I woke my girlfriend up, she would start moving, and the thing would notice both of us. But I was so scared that I kept trying. This went around for maybe less than 15 minutes, before I realized I still had my girlfriend's foot in my hand below the blanket, so the thing would not be able to see me moving. Only using my wrist, I slightly pulled her foot back and forth, whispering her name again and again, but no response. Then, I stood in shock when I saw the creature stand up again and started walking backwards, still looking at me and disappearing into the darkness of the patio, doing the clicking sounds again. I passed saliva and blinked a few times, realizing my eyes twitched and itched from staring at the creature the whole time. For some reason, I couldn't turn my head around. I kept looking in the direction where the creature disappeared, listening for sounds and waiting for it to appear once again. A few minutes passed, and I took the chance to turn around. Slowly, as if in slow motion, I turned my head to my girlfriend and started calling her name louder while pushing her leg and quickly scribbling my fingers on the sole of her foot to wake her up fast. Her foot jerked and she started turning. I stood up to her shoulders and patted her, whispering, "Hey, wake up!" She opened her eyes and squinted at me, adjusting to the light of the TV, wondering why I woke her up. I kept telling her to remain still and silent when I heard the sound again. She looked at me, noticed the concern in my eyes, and asked, "What's wrong?" "Shh, be quiet," I followed, putting 2 fingers on her lips and looking into her eyes. I could see she was getting freaked out. I don't blame her. I would be too if someone woke me up, looking scared and telling me to be quiet. The clicking sound went off again, but it was louder this time, almost as if that thing was on the other side of the window. This time, both of us heard the noise and more scared. "What is that?" my girlfriend asked, but I remained quiet. Again, in slow motion, I started to turn my head to the window to check, and there it was. The thing was right outside the window, only a couple feet away and staring right back at me. This time, I had a clearer vision of how it looked, and I was wrong. I was petrified in fear when I noticed it didn't have a mouth where a person would have it. Instead, the mouth was on its neck, which opened horizontally, not vertically. As it opened its mouth, it vibrated with the clicking sounds, and hundreds of small razor-like teeth shined with the window glare. It had oval-shaped eyes that were as dark as the night. I felt its gaze pierce through my soul. I started shaking and breathing faster, not believing what I was seeing. My girlfriend peeked by my side to see what I was looking at, and I instantly felt her body tense up under me as she started to ask me in a trembling voice, what was that thing? But no answer came out of me. Now, we were both scared to even move a muscle. After the humanoid noticed my girlfriend move, it gave a step forward and lowered its head, almost as if it was scanning us. We jumped in fear after seeing the thing doing it, because we thought it would start coming toward us. My heart was beating so fast that I thought I would faint any time. Then, the thing began to walk slowly to its right side, in the direction where the door to the corridor was, resuming the clicking sounds. If you have seen the movie Signs, and remember the scene where the humanoid came out of the bushes outside the house, that would be an accurate representation of what we saw. We took a good look at every inch of that thing's body. It walked with its head turned to us. After we lost sight of it through the window, we both sat up and looked at each other, when suddenly, we heard something scratch the metal door that led to the corridor, as if the thing was grazing its fingers on it. Without thinking twice, I grabbed my girlfriend's wrist and jolted out of the living room, locking ourselves in her bedroom. We sat on the floor right next to the bedroom, hiding in case that thing got inside. The scratching sounds continued, and my girlfriend started to sob, still asking about what we saw. I felt powerless, knowing I couldn't do much to reassure her. I could only hold her and hope for the thing to give up and leave. The noise continued for about 3 minutes, when it suddenly stopped. Then, we began hearing stepping noises all around the house, and we kept turning to whatever direction we heard the noise come from. Eventually, the noises ceased, and after an hour or so, we figured the creature had left. My girlfriend, still with tears in her eyes, told me if we could lay in bed. I agreed because my back was hurting from being in that crouched position for over an hour. We slowly crawled into bed, making the least noise possible and covering ourselves with another blanket. "Don't worry, everything is going to be okay tomorrow. Try to sleep," I told her as I tightened my grip on her. She didn't reply, but after a while, she fell asleep again. I didn't get a minute of sleep that night. I kept my eyes open, listening to every sound around us. The next day, we didn't even want to touch the subject. All we said was that creature was not from this world. My girlfriend said she felt the creature's gaze pierce into her, almost as if that thing was feeling with its pure sight. Nothing else was said. We were left sort of traumatized. I realized that she was going to have to put up with that fear of going outside in the future, and I didn't want that thing anywhere near her again, or her family. Days after the encounter, we both suffered from nightmares. She mentioned that sometimes she would wake up in the middle of the night screaming and trembling, and wouldn't be able to stop until her mom went to check on her. The fences that separated the patio and woods have been redone since. They now stand at 2 meters tall, blocking any easy access from the woods. Before this, they had to make sure they didn't have to go outside at night. They have not had any encounters since, but my girlfriend insists that the patio gives her the chills at night. I keep wondering what that thing was, that humanoid creature, some kind of alien. Here's the story. Basically, I live in Westmoreland County of Pennsylvania. For a while, actually, there's been strange occurrences around, but recently, the most real and convincing occurrence that there is a cryptid. Basically, my girlfriend vacationed at a place where there was known to be Seneca tribes, so I don't know if she brought back something. Anyway, she's over tonight, and I live with another friend, FYI. Anyway, we take our dog out, and our motion lights aren't triggered, when all of a sudden, there's a hiss right next to us, and the bushes shake, and we rush the dog in, as we have no idea what it could be, as this area is prone to raccoons and deer and some coyotes. Me and my friend go outside with weapons and flashlights, as we have a dog, and is partially blind and has a bad leg, so we can't risk him getting attacked. Along with that, there's a guy in our rather wooded community that has a brain issue and tends to wander at night. So with that in mind, we go outside and we hear a bird call. Remind you, it's 1 a.m. We hear this bird call non-stop. In my mind, I'm thinking I'm being lured by a skinwalker or the crazy dude, so we go inside and look out our patio window only to see a deer at our fence line. The deer's back legs looked mangled. I kid you not. It actually looked like it's walking with its back legs turned backwards. There's a deer that roams back there that has a broken leg, but only one, and he's always with the family. Anyway, we see this deer, but when it first looks at us with the flashlight on its eyes, they are green. It puts its head down and stares at us, and we shine the light around and back on it, and its eyes are now red. When they go back to green, at that point, I'm convinced this is a skinwalker. It turns and is walking around. It isn't listening to me screaming to leave, so I call it a Navajo witch. I don't know why I didn't know what to get its attention, but I kid you not, it turned its head and stuck its neck up so freakishly long and stared at me. I actually got spooked. I'm a pretty religious dude who often ghost hunts and goes to creepy abandoned spots, but I kid you not, I kinda heart dropped. So at this point, I go and get my silver cross and shine the flashlight on the cross so it can see the cross shining, and it immediately looks away. And I tell that if it can't cross the fence line because I don't give it permission, and it knows it can't beat the one that's on the cross, it straight up walked away and didn't look back. I come back inside. My friend goes to sleep, and I go into my bedroom where my girlfriend is asleep. I lay down next to her, and her eyes out on the back of her head. I wake her up, and it turns out she was having a sleep paralysis episode, and she had 2 other sleep paralysis episodes during the entire time that me and my friend were outside. I'm wondering if there's some cryptid who is attacking her mind while distracting us, or by coincidence, did I happen to have a raccoon hiss at us, or someone do a bird call? We see a mangled red-eyed deer, and my girlfriend all have sleep paralysis within a 2-hour period. I'm asking this as I'm pretty knowledgeable of demons and stuff, but I don't think he wore the 2 things off the same way. The deer essentially looked like it had the posture of a crab. It did not have the thick thighs in the back like a deer does. It has the legs that looked backwards and mangled. I know it could all be a coincidence, it just seems a little weird. Also, I'm aware skinwalkers are pretty much Navajo exclusive or whatever, but I don't know what else to call something like that. I'm not really sure if this is a true story or not, but I thought you'd like to hear it. Skinwalkers are not some mystical fantasy creatures. No, they are evil witches who like to cause pain and misfortune on others, and who may even cause death. In order to get their powers, they have to sacrifice somebody they most love. The more they sacrifice, the more powers they get. This is an old story that happened in the 40s or the 50s, about a man who lived with his sheep and his dog in the middle of nowhere in his hogan. For weeks, he heard and saw strange things happening around him, like a black shadow running, knocking on his house, a man's cough, and his sheep missing, and later found dead and mutilated, until he found his dog dead. Tired and afraid of this, he went to a medicine man. They told the medicine man that he was experiencing. He blessed the man and told him to cover himself with ash, leave no part uncovered, and to sit outside his house with a rifle and to wait for it to come. And when you see it, you'll know when you see it. You shoot at it, and it will leave you alone. So the man did as asked. He waited in the dark for a long time before he heard it. Something was coming towards his house. When he looked to his left, he saw a dog or a coyote. He knew it then for what it was. He slowly raised the rifle and aimed it at the dog creature and shot at it. The scary part was when the bullet hit it, instead of a dog cry, the dog creature let out the scream of a man who had just gotten shot, and the dog creature immediately turned and ran away. After that, the man didn't see no strange thing again. He even got a new dog. He fought with a skinwalker and won. At the time this story takes place, I was 14, almost 15, and a sophomore in high school. I've never had a paranormal encounter in my life, but I still somewhat believed in the paranormal. This is the first close encounter I have ever had in my life. In case you don't know what a skinwalker is, they're people that can morph into an animal of their choice and originate from Navajo legends. I'll go further into depth about why I think this encounter was a skinwalker later in the story. So, I was at my cousin's house with both of my stepbrothers, and all of us were really into Nerf guns at the time. I'll refer to my cousin as T, my older stepbrother is J, and my younger is A. For our entertainment, we decided to split up into 2 teams and have what we called a Nerf war, very creatively. The goal of the game was to knock down both of our opponents by hitting them once with a Nerf bullet, as it was pretty difficult to accomplish. Once the person had been shot, they were out of the game and not able to be revived. And once both of them had been shot, the game had been won by the other team. Simple enough. The boundaries were a couple of blocks long, which included a nearby park that we liked to stay at and hide from the other team. Because it was getting dark, we had to leave my cousin's house soon. We decided to have another quick round. We watched as T and A ran in the direction of a nearby ditch, so Jay and I decided to run towards the park, which was behind us. We ran for a couple of minutes until we reached the huge fake rock that had a slide on top, and we decided to camp up there. For a few minutes we sat there, waiting to see them try to sneak up on us, because they knew that we were at the park. Jay and I noticed that there was a dog next to the jungle gym, walking around aimlessly, and we thought that maybe it was T's Chihuahua. However, we heard somebody call its name, and realized that there was a guy standing in the nearby garden. Naturally, we didn't think much of it, except how it was creepy that he was just standing there. I tried to rationalize and told Jay that he was probably watering the plants, despite the fact that he obviously wasn't. Before we could realize, the man was gone, but again, we thought nothing of it. Out in the field next to the park, I spotted two figures lying down next to a hill, T and A. Jay and I split up. I hid behind a row of bongos and we hid behind a nearby rock. After a few moments of silence between us, I told him that we should move into the nearby brush and stalk them from afar, but he refused. Out of nowhere, we heard a loud screech coming from the nearby brush. We thought it was some type of bird, specifically an eagle, but I also suspected it could be a coyote. A few moments later, I was looking up and admiring the sky when I noticed a shooting star, which I initially thought was a plane. I'm not sure whether it has any significance to the story, but you'll find out why I think it might be later. From that point on, we both had very strange feelings that we were being watched by somebody or something. I had very weird tingling sensations that started at my feet and went up to my chest multiple times, and Jay said he had a burning chest pain that lasted for a long while, to the point where he could barely run. After we left our spot, and were going to take a back route to T's house, we heard the screech again, but it sounded like it came from where we were hiding. Ultimately, we won the match, but our parents were looking for us and we had to leave his house. T decided to spend the night at our house, as we were waiting for him in the car. A asked if we too heard the screech. We started to discuss what we had thought it was, and we all agreed that it was some kind of eagle. However, after discussing it with T, he told us what he had encountered. When they were in the field stalking us, T said he heard the screech right in his ear, which is nowhere near where we heard it. After that, he said he felt like somebody was behind him, and he turned to see what was bothering him. Right as he did, he said he was drawn to the same shooting star we saw. After we had left the park, which they weren't aware of, they said they both heard Jay's voice calling desperately out for A, his brother, thinking he might have been hurt. T decided that he should go help, but something just felt off. They ultimately decided to go back to the house. Looking back, we learned why if they didn't make that decision, they would have been as good as dead. T said that he had the exact same feelings as we did while making his way back to the house. Because I was a big fan of horror stories and had heard much about skinwalkers, I asked them if they thought it could possibly be a skinwalker, but nobody really thought so. I decided to do some research, and we all realized that a skinwalker fits the situation perfectly. First of all, an eagle is one of the most common forms that skinwalkers take, which would explain how we all thought the screech came from an eagle. Secondly, both teams heard the screech at different locations, and skinwalkers are known to move extremely quick. Third, they can morph into familiar faces and also imitate voices, which would explain how they heard Jay's voice calling out after we left the park. Lastly, they can actually dig through your mind and know what your fears are, and T was always afraid of people getting hurt while we were playing. That night, we were all extremely scared because of all the videos and stories we watched about skinwalkers. However, the final piece to the puzzle was when I woke up to A standing in the doorway, crying. Our dog had died the night before in her sleep. According to one of the many sources I found, I read that some skinwalkers are able to poison the loved ones of their victims after an encounter. What do you guys think? Do you think what I encountered was an actual skinwalker, or was it just a huge coincidence? These following sightings occurred in Madison County, Illinois. It was Christmas Eve, around December 24th, 1980, 7 p.m. It was very, very cold. I just turned onto Illinois Railroad 44, heading north, and was picking up speed when I saw something in the middle of the road. There were no other cars in the area, so I turned my bright lights on and started hitting my brakes. As I got closer, I saw a Bigfoot just standing in the middle of the road, looking at me, as if it was blinded by my headlights. I came to almost a complete and utter stop as I looked at it and moved the car into the opposite lane to avoid hitting it. I came within inches of it and looking at it the entire time. It was standing up, but seemed to be kind of bent over at the waist. It was holding its right arm up against its chest, like if you would have your arm in a sling. I estimate it well over 7 feet tall. At the time, I had a brother who was 6'8", and I know it was much taller than he was. I keep saying it because I'm not sure of its sex. I was in amazement and not sure what to do. I decided to go to the next road and turn around, but it was gone when I returned, around 2 minutes later. The best is I can remember the temperature outside. It was freezing outside, well below zero. This is a very rural area, and there is no reason anybody would be standing in the middle of the road on Christmas Eve in this kind of weather, dressed up like a Bigfoot. Especially, who's that tall to begin with? I am a hunter and have spent many hours in the woods, but I have never seen anything like that before or after. I've been wanting to talk about this for years, to give this report about what happened to me. I went and reported it when it happened to the local police, but they didn't make an official report, just because of the circumstances. This happened back in 1978. I was a teletype operator in the U.S. Air Force. I was a crypto guy. We monitored Russian and Chinese teletype. In 1978, I had just come out of tech school and went back home to southern Illinois, where I was raised. The reason I found this was through some other guy's website who had something to do with the Southern University of Edwardville. I grew up in East St. Louis, which is 4 miles south of Monk's Mound. I went home on leave in 1978, the fall of 78. I have a top secret clearance. In fact, I went one above top secret my last year of the service overseas, so I was very leery of saying anything. I was just on my way up to visit a friend one morning, on home on leave. I had my dad's car, and he's at work. I'm driving up the campus, up on University Drive, and there's this little old church, St. Paul's United Church of Christ, right there on the frontage road, right before you head up into the bluffs, into the university proper. I had driven down there before, and for some reason, just went to see what was down there. I had driven down there, and for some reason, just to see what was down there. I had never driven down there before. It was kind of a foggy morning, kind of misty and rainy. There's nothing behind this old church other than a bunch of hay fields. There was a bunch of hay rings where the guy had just drug through and done the hay thing. I'm driving down the road. I was going to turn around in the grass behind the church, and I could see this bear way down on the dirt road, and it's bent over, splashing water in a puddle in the middle of the road. As I pull closer to this thing, it's not a bear, and it is huge. I bring my car within about 10 yards of it, and then veer off into the field, and get out with my door between me and the thing. And it stands up, and it's like 8 or 9 feet tall. It looked like a black humanoid. I grew up in southern Illinois. I am a hunter, and my father was a hunter. I had a goose gun in my trunk. I get the gun out. Something in my head clicked, and I'm thinking. Of course, there were all these stories about things being up in Illinois, but I never really heard of anything about my area. But something in my head clicked. I remember hearing about Bigfoot in California, and I thought, this is one of those Bigfoots. I'm going to wound this thing, and Barnum and Bailey, here I come. I shot off with this goose gun to the left of this thing, and it did not move. And then I shot off to the right. It didn't move again. Something inside me just said, "You can't hurt this thing, and if you try to hurt it, it is only going to hurt you." And with that, it kind of shrugged what it looked like its shoulders at me, and it binged off into the woods that are just north of that road. And each one of its leaps, binges, jumps, whatever it was about 20 feet at a time, and it was gone. Well, I completely freaked out. I went into the local gas station and washed my face off, and I drove right into Edwardsville, into the Madison County Sheriff's Office, and there was an old-time deputy, and he looked at me after I told him the whole thing, and he said, "You know, I would think you were crazy or on drugs if it weren't for the fact that I had ever heard the same story in the last couple of weeks, and 3 of them were from good friends of mine who were out hunting and saw the same thing you did. If I was you, knowing the kind of job you got and you're getting ready to do, I wouldn't tell anybody about this for a long time, and you would be a lot better off." And that was probably the most sound advice I've ever got, because if I had told somebody about this, they would have jerked my clearance and messed me around in the Air Force. The first incident occurred on Monday night, June 4th, 1973. The other 2 happened between the 4th of June and the 8th of June on 1973. In 3 separate incidents, 3 residents reported seeing and being chased by a musty-odored, red-eyed, human-sized creature or monster. The creature was described as 5 feet 8 inches tall, broad-shouldered, with red eyes that cannot stand light. It makes no sound, even when it walks. One male described it to police at an incident which it ripped his shirt and scratched his chest. Reports describe the creature as lurking in the woods. My mother and I were traveling between New Douglas and Livingston on New Douglas Road, heading west to Livingston. It was dark, and in the headlights, we both saw it run from the left side of the road to the right side of the road, in front of the car. The road had steep banks on both sides, and it ran down and across the road and out of sight on the other side of the road very quickly. It went from being on all 4s to 2 legs as it was crossing. It was big, brown, hairy, and very fast. My mother and I both looked at each other and just said, "Did you see that?" at the same time. We were scared to turn around, but did go back with 2 other people within about 30 minutes of the sighting, but we didn't see a thing. After we saw this, my mom told me that when she was a kid living in New Douglas, that there were stories of a crazy guy that lived in the woods in the same area. I can tell you 100% that this wasn't a person or any other animal that I have ever seen. I had just gotten my son down to sleep. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. He sleeps in the back bedroom. I happened to walk by the window in the hallway because I had to go to the bathroom. For some reason, I heard a cough. It sounded like somebody clearing their throat. I had just put the pool down. We have one of those quick set ring pools that you blow up for my son. I just took it down and was drying it off. I thought somebody was out there looking at it or messing with it, so I opened the blinds and looked. I didn't see anything right off the bat. But then I saw something between the woods and my shed. It was just standing there, and it was big. The head looked huge, so I ran upstairs and got my night vision. When I kicked that night vision on, I could see every detail. It was staring up in the trees. He was at least 8.5 foot tall, about 40 yards from the window. He looked to be gray in color. It looked like a really big human. If people want to know what the face looks like, if you put this guy in a Viking movie with a horned helmet on, people would say he was a Viking. That's how human looking he was. He had really sunken eyes, but he was just looking up in the trees. And then I heard somebody's radio down at the parking lot of the bike trail. It was pretty amazing. I was watching him and thinking, he's hanging out there because he's waiting for people to leave. Nobody could see him there. And the only reason I did is because I was walking by the window and saw something in my yard that is not normally there. I even went to take my wife and have her seen too, but he was gone. I have been recently telling myself to finally make an account to submit my stories. I wasn't going to do it until the light in my daughter's room turned off a few nights ago. While this was happening, I would post in a Facebook group, update every 6 months to a year as a way to get out what's going on. Typing it up and reading it out loud helped me make and realize this crap was happening and how crazy it sounded. I'm going to copy and paste all that over here and wind it all up in the end to what's going on now, possibly new revelations that I've had. This all began back in December of 2014 and ended around December of 2018. I'll include as much detail as I can, and remember, and will also change the names of people since events and stories like this are often met with doubt or ridicule. In 2014, my pregnant wife, our son, my wife's niece, whom we gained temporary custody of for a year so she could finish high school. Her son and I all moved to an area close to where I grew up in Central Texas. It was a growing suburb with good schools and a good community that was located close to where I was working. To the east is a large safe city, and to every other direction is ranching land, hill country, and old creeks. We found a house to rent in a subdivision that started being built in the late 1990s and finished around 2010 that has a nice creek running through it. It was once a Texas Ranger fort before the Civil War. There were many kind of skirmishes that occurred in this area between the Rangers and the natives. Some of them are pretty well known if you know the history of the area. There are a few locations miles away where the natives massacred settlers traveling between towns in the early to mid 1800s. Also, there is a location not too far from here where they found the remains of a 14,000 or so year old Neanderthal, which at the time was one of the oldest ever found in this region. I guess I'm saying this area is old and has some history. Anyway, after the Civil War started, the Texas Rangers abandoned the fort, and it was almost immediately set on fire by the natives. We rented this house during the summer. There was nothing special about it. It was one of possibly 10 home models were built in that section of the subdivision. Every house had 2 trees in the front yard, a 2-car driveway, and around 20 feet of HOA-approved grass between each house. We lived so close to the elementary school that we could hear the bell for school every day. One afternoon, I wanted to show everyone the areas I remembered growing up. We drove by the house I grew up in, my old high school, and a few other areas that I remembered running around and causing the same minor trouble you did growing up in what was once a small town of 2,000. We passed the old burnt-down house that was said to be haunted by the meth heads that everybody talked about, but nobody ever saw. The woods that was said to have a giant shadow dog running around at night. And finally, the cemetery that the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre opening scene was shot at. Our niece was fascinated with the cemetery because even though the area was built up, you could tell it was most likely filmed there. Since she liked it so much, I thought I'd give her a scare by driving everyone by the old cemetery on the other side of town. It was a private cemetery that was located off one of the FM roads and said to have some of the settlers that were killed by the natives there. This place probably hadn't heard or had any new arrivals in about 70 years. It was getting dark by the time we got there, so I decided to pull off the road to try and shine my headlights on it so everybody could see. As soon as I did, I felt off, like I shouldn't have been there. The area was in the middle of a drought, and because of that, all the ground had massive cracks in it. Some of the markers and headstones had even fallen over, and the ones that were still standing were leaning over pretty bad. The picket fence surrounding the markers was barely standing and discolored, and even though no one did maintenance on the grounds, it looked like the grass wasn't wild. Instead, it was oddly bare compared to the surrounding area, with only a few tufts of tall weeds scattered about. Just then, the sun set behind the cedar and oak trees that covered the horizon. That looks creepy. My wife said jokingly. Yeah, with the way the headlights hit those rocks over there, it looks like dolls sitting on the ground, I said, trying to scare our niece. Only when I looked harder, there were old dolls sitting upright in the middle of the cemetery. Old, sun-bleached dolls. They could have been there for days or a few months. It had been so hot and dry in that area for so long, you couldn't tell. Everyone in the car got quiet, just staring and trying to figure out if we should laugh or be freaked out. The wind blew a little and something caught my eye. There was a lone dead tree off in the distance. This tree was an old post oak, about 40 feet tall, completely bare of leaves. Originally, what I thought were branches, small branches, were actually what I looked like chicken bones hanging, a lot of them. And yes, they were dolls hanging too. Alright, who wants to get some snow cones? I said as cheerfully as I could, in an attempt to disrupt everyone's gaze before they saw what I did. The mood quickly changed as our niece and her son all hollered, "Me!" And just like that, everyone put our previous stop in the back of their minds as they went through all the different flavors they wanted on their snow cones. About a week later, our son, who was about 6 at the time, started telling us that he was seeing shadows in the halls and eyes looking down at him from the AC vents in the house. Our niece started complaining of the shadows in the house and feeling like she was being watched, while her son, who was 2, would walk, point to walls and start jabbering to them, then would suddenly get upset and start crying. My wife and I never saw, felt, or experienced anything and didn't really think much about it, other than that it was a new house for us, and the kids did like to watch scary movies. One night, I had to go drive past an old cemetery for one reason or another. While passing it, I thought I saw a deer out of the corner of my eye, and I immediately slowed down, except it wasn't a deer. It was some kind of large shadow that moved across the tree line and smoothly into the cemetery and then vanished. This is where it all began for me. On the way home, I felt like I was being followed. I kept looking in all my mirrors, taking side streets, going through subdivisions, going through parking lots, but there were no cars following me. I jumped on the toll road and floored it, turned around, got back on it, and went home. When I got home, the kids were watching a movie, and my wife was in the kitchen, making herself a hot Cheeto sour pickled covered in Kool-Aid with lime juice and a warhead in the middle. Yeah, I don't get it either, but she was about 4 months pregnant at the time, and finally starting to show. I rubbed her belly and gave her a kiss, and told her I was going to lie down for a few minutes. It was dark, but still only about 8:45, 3 to 4 hours before everybody went to bed on a weekend. At the time, we had a headboard that had curved decorative steel bars spaced about 18 inches apart, so you could see and touch the wall, and if you reached far enough, you could feel the carpet on the floor. I was lying down on my stomach, trying to clear my mind, and had just closed my eyes when I had this feeling of dread. After about 10 seconds of this, I finally opened my eyes, expecting to see the wall. What I saw instead, I will never forget. It was a face grinning back at me from less than 6 inches away. It had red and black skin, no hair, black eyes, and bright yellow teeth. Imagine a mix between Darth Maul from Star Wars and the demon from Insidious. My brain said, "Stay calm, don't show fear." But out of my mouth came a flurry of profanity. My mind started screaming, "Get out of here!" But with every ounce of self-restraint I could even possibly muster up, I rolled out of bed, turned my back to this thing I just saw, and walked away down the hall and back into the living room. "I thought you were going to lay down for a while," my wife said with a sour look on her face as she took a bite from her sour science experiment that was on her plate. "Yeah, I think I'm going to lay down in here instead. I thought I saw something." I replied calmly, trying not to freak out my family. I don't know how I did it. I've been in combat situations in different scenarios in my life where the lives of people around me were on the line, and I don't think I felt more physical and emotional fear than I did in those 10 seconds. Not only did I see what at times felt like a pure incarnation of evil, but it was in my house, where my pregnant wife slept, where my son played, where my niece's son liked to hide. This thing was in my house, and it was playing games with us. Over the next week or so, things got worse. I was having nightmares and hearing footsteps in the house. My son was having night terrors. Our niece couldn't fall asleep, and her son was always crying. I was new to my section and had recently changed jobs when I re-enlisted, so it was a new situation for me. I worked along many civilian contractors. Most of them were retired sergeant majors. A few of them were lower enlisted guys that just happened to be at the right place at the right time for a job opening up when their contract was up. Mrs. Z was somewhere in between. She was the only contractor I had spoke to regularly. So when I came into work one Monday, looking like something was wrong, she asked me if everything was okay. I was trying to test how she would respond. My son is saying that he's seeing shadows in the house and it's keeping him up at night. And last night was a rough night, I said. Really? Is your house haunted? She said totally seriously. Boom, question answered. I looked around. Well, I proceeded to tell her everything that had happened. She explained to me that her family were strong Catholics and from Brazil. Her mother was able to sense things, could see auras, and would end up giving me some tips that might be helpful. Well, nothing helped. Then finally, she said her family was going to go to South Texas to see some friends this coming weekend, and while they were there, they were going to stop by this miracle church to pick up some holy water and would pick some up for me as well. The next Monday could not come fast enough. At work, she handed me the holy water. I looked at it. Was in an old water bottle. Odd. But who am I to say what type of container such a gift should be held in? She told me what to do. Put it in a spray bottle. Spray every corner of every room of the house, every closet, pantry, bathroom, up high and down low. Spray above every door and every window, every AC vent. Do this all while saying this Bible verse. Start in the front rooms of the house. Leave the back door open and slowly work your way to the back door so anything in there is forced to leave the house. She handed me a slip of paper. I looked at it, and it read, Plead my cause, O Lord, with them that strive with me. Fight against them that fight against me. Take hold of their shield and buckler, and stand up for mine help. Draw out also the spear, and stop the way against them that persecute me. Say unto my soul, I am thy salvation. Let them be confounded, and put to shame that seek after my soul. Let them be turned back, and brought to confusion that devise my hurt. Let them be as chaff before the wind, and let the angel of the Lord persecute them. For without cause they have hid for me their net in a pit, which without cause they have digged for my soul. Let destruction come upon him at unawareness, and let his net that he hath hid catch himself into that very destruction, let him fall. And my soul shall be joyful in the Lord, it shall rejoice in his salvation. After you are finished, keep it in your wallet for as long as you can, so it'll always be with you, she said with a smile. As soon as I got home, I did exactly as she said, twice. That evening, there was a noticeable change in the house. Everybody was laughing and having a good time in a way we haven't in months. When it was time for bed, no one had any complaints and all the kids went to bed without problems, including myself. I woke up in the middle of the night, unable to talk, unable to move. I was completely paralyzed. I don't know if it was from fear or sleep paralysis. Something was in the room. I could sense it. I could feel its hate towards me, feeling ice cold like death while burning up from pure disgust. It was watching me. It was angry. You know how I said seeing that demon thing was the most frightened I'd ever been? Nah. This is it. I could feel my death. I could feel the hatred this thing had for me. I was fighting to move, fighting to tilt my head, even a bit, so I could at least look at what was going to end my life. Then suddenly I remembered. My pregnant wife and the little baby girl that was growing in her belly were laying right next to me. I stopped fighting it. What if it moved and woke her up? What if her being asleep is the only thing that is keeping her from experiencing the fear that I am feeling? What if her sleeping happily right next to me is what is keeping her safe? What if I wake her up and it kills all three of us? I accepted my fate. If me dying silently in the night means she is safe, fine. So I closed my eyes. I relaxed and started praying. God, please protect my wife and children. Please let me fall back asleep. Please keep them safe. If I die tonight, please let me die in my sleep. I must have said it 1,000 times in my head. I wake up to my alarm going off. I made it. I'm alive. I lean over to look at my wife, and suddenly her eyes pop open. I gotta pee. And she hobbles quickly to the bathroom. I get ready for work, and that was the last I ever saw of the demon creature. But it isn't the end. Over the next 3 years, my beautiful daughter was born. My wife started working again. I got a promotion. Everything was going amazing. Then I developed heart problems. I was diagnosed with Brugada syndrome, which is very serious. The doctor said that I could basically drop dead at any moment, and it's amazing you haven't already. Thanks, Doc. A month later, I had a defibrillator implanted in my chest, and 8 months later, I was medically discharged from the military. I was only 27. Our niece and her son had moved out. Then, in June of 2017, my sister passed away from a seizure suddenly. She had some serious medical problems but was working through them, and for the first time in years, had a positive outlook on life, making plans for the future, and was back to being the beautiful person she had always been. It hit the family hard. One night, in August of 2017, I was unable to sleep. My new job had me working nights, so on my days off, I'd go to sleep around 3 in the morning. My wife was already in bed. I went to lay down but kept hearing noises, creaks, chirps, and what sounded like footsteps. You know, the kind of stuff that you write off as the house settling, the wind blowing outside, or the AC kicking on or off. I kept my eyes closed, mainly not to alarm myself, and try to force myself to fall asleep. Then, I got this feeling that something was in my room. It wasn't like the feeling I had previously. I was just uncomfortable, like something was off. I opened my eyes, and as soon as I did, a shadow bolted around the corner in the room. I thought it was my wife. Babe, you okay? My daughter moved around in her crib a little, and I looked over to her, only to see my wife asleep next to me. This happened a few more times, but things were starting up again slowly. It started with my oldest son sleepwalking. He had never done it before. We would wake up with him staring at a wall in our bedroom. It completely frightened my wife with the first time. I'm not gonna lie, I thought he was possessed or something the first time. He was just standing there in the corner of the room, breathing hard, and would quietly say, "Ha, ha, ha." Really creepy. But after the 3rd or 4th time we found him doing that, or found him walking around the house, we would just gently guide him back to his room, and everything would be okay. He never remembered it in the morning. Then, about 3 months later, the sleepwalking stopped. I kept hearing the footsteps though. Light bulbs would go out faster than usual. Different rooms of the house would always be extreme temperatures. One room would be uncomfortably warm, while another room, that was along the same exterior wall, would be really cold. The insulation in the attic seemed to be the same. There were no outside factors like a tree blocking one room and not the other, and the AC vents were never clogged or bent. My wife would mention all of these things to me, but she never really wanted to discuss anything that was going on. It freaked her out, but she didn't want anybody to know how badly. Whenever I would want to talk to her about it, she would just nod her head and agree with any solution I thought would fix it or explain it. She did ask to place crosses above the exterior doors in each room, and that's about it. One night, my wife took the kids to one of her friend's house about a half an hour away, which left me alone. This doesn't happen at all often, especially at night. I'm used to kids running around, babies crying, dog running into things and barking at the squirrels that constantly pester him outside the window. So, I used this opportunity, as any parent could I guess, to sleep. I like to sleep in their living room on the couch. Something about my back being to a wall in the center of the house. My wife doesn't understand it, but this is my time. She isn't here to pester me, to try to convince me to sleep in the empty bed while she is away. So I turn on Netflix, put on a Planet Earth documentary, and slowly drift asleep to the narrator's calm voice and whale mating calls, or something like that. I'm suddenly awakened by a loud scream. I look towards the TV. Netflix is already in its "Are you still there?" mode. I look at the clock. It's a little after 3. Did I scream in my sleep and wake myself up? I jump up, and if it wasn't me, that means there's somebody outside my house again. I forgot to mention, we have had problems recently with high school kids throwing parties like they do, getting busted by the cops, and running away through people's backyards trying to get away. Annoying, but nothing too major. We've all been there before. Just be prepared to get yelled at if anyone catches you. There was also a break in one of the other side of the neighborhood a few weeks prior to the events that are unrelated. I jump up to get my gun that I have hidden away in a drop-down shelf behind the couch. A recent purchase that I was quite happy with. I run to the door, look through the peephole, see nobody is there, so I open the door. I walk around the outside of the house as quietly as possible. I don't want to startle my neighbors that already don't like me too much because of my new work hours. The wind blows, and my dogs go absolutely crazy in the house. I take off, adrenaline pumping like crazy. I thought for sure somebody was inside the house. The door had closed slightly, so I shouldered it. It flung open. Nothing. I was fully expecting somebody to be in my house. Instead, I see my dog slowly raise his head and look at me like I disturbed his sleep, then turn his head and go back to sleep. I checked every room in the house, under and every bed, moved all the clothes hanging in every closet, everything. The house was empty, and I was unable to fall back asleep until my family got back the next morning. Everything got quiet again after that. My wife had our youngest son in June of 2018. In September of 2018, I began going through confirmation classes through the Catholic Church, and this is when things started happening again. The footsteps, shadows, all of it. I would hear scratching on the exterior door about 4 times a week. Whenever I got out to look out the peephole, there would be nobody there. My father-in-law had a job up near where we lived, and instead of staying in a hotel, he would pay us what his company gave him for a hotel if he could stay with us. We thought that was a good idea. He quickly began to see things, shadows. He said he is seeing shadows pass by his door, what looks like a person walking past the bathroom door when he is shaving. He started hearing footsteps walking down the hall to the room that he was staying in. He jokingly asked me about it, and I gave him a brief rundown of what had happened over the past few years, without getting into too much detail. He said he believed me, and that he never felt anger, just annoyance from whatever it was. One night while I was working, my oldest son had his friend over. I get a call at around 11 p.m. from him crying his eyes out, and barely understandable. My wife grabs the phone. "Hey, did you get that?" "What? No, what happened? Is he okay?" "He said he saw your sister in the hallway." I started to tear up. My oldest son and my sister were very close. She worked in a comic book store which hosted different card game tournaments, and even got opening night tickets to many of the new Marvel and DC movies that were coming out. What more could a boy want in an aunt? "My sister? What do you mean?" She handed the phone back to him. "Dad, I saw her. She was just standing there." A wave of emotion came over me, followed by a wave of questions. What did she look like? Was she happy? Sad? Did she move at all? How did you feel when you saw her? These were all the questions I could think of. What I would tell my family to do next depended solely on the answers to these questions. "She looked happy." His 10-year-old voice broke a little. "She smiled and waved at me. I felt happy when I saw her," he finally said. "Well, good. She wanted to just let you know that she was doing okay, and she missed you," I said, trying to calm him down. If it was anything else, I would have not come home, and we would have stayed in a hotel for the night. It's been about 8 months since that happened. Since then, nothing creepy has happened in my house. Absolutely everything stopped, and I'm thoroughly convinced that my sister made everything leave, and that was her way of letting everyone know my family was safe. I told one person about my story. They wanted to know more about the first time I felt the demon in my room, and then I felt I was going to die. They tried to relate it to my heart problems. A symptom of Brugada syndrome is a racing heart, like 300 BPM, or beats per minute, which causes blood to not flow properly to my brain, which leads to blacking out. Without immediate medical treatment, the person will die within minutes. They said that the experience could be the result of being awoken because my heart was literally about to beat out of my chest, and everything else was my brain just trying to understand what was happening. I don't know. I'm not ruling it out, but the doctor said that if my heart begins to show the symptoms, there is literally a 0% chance of pulling out of it without getting resuscitated. The scream I heard when I was alone may have been somebody outside, and when I went to check, they may have tried to come inside, only to be met by my intimidating 40-pound Brittany Spaniel. Not very likely, since I would have probably seen them run away from the house. And my dog is lazy, but not lazy enough to fall back asleep immediately after barking at a potential intruder. Those are all the explanations that I can come up with. We move out of the house in a few months to a new construction on a few acres out in the country. Hopefully nothing follows us, or nothing is already there. Angry people are disturbing their final resting place. My sister has already saved my family once. I don't want her to have to do it again. And now here I am, in a newly built house at 1 a.m. It's June 2020, and 3 days ago the lights on my daughter's room turned off. I was in the room next to mine, now almost 5-year-old daughter. My wife is in the kitchen. My youngest son was asleep, and my oldest was playing Xbox in the playroom. I say this because there's no way somebody could have turned the lights off without me seeing them. I even heard the click of the switch. My daughter has been terrified of her room since we moved in. We thought it was because of her room as being far away from us and big. But now that all this is happening again, I'm starting to question things. It made me sit down and think about all the times I thought I felt things touch my arms or legs and just blew it off, thinking it was a muscle spasm or twitch of the skin. Sometimes I see shadows out of the corner of my eye. That got me thinking about the first time I thought I saw a ghost, and how I felt there was an evil in my childhood house. The times I almost died. The times I should have died. Recently, my oldest son told me a story about walking around in the storm drains of the old neighborhood, which led me to conclude what him and his friends saw was a Skinwalker. I'll post those stories if this one goes well. Possibly a few I believe I have a strange incident worth mentioning that involves the Mothman, but I'm not entirely sure. I'll leave it up to you to put those pieces together. See, my knowledge of the Mothman is very minimal, but I do know that there was something involving a town called Point Pleasant, in which the Mothman appeared on a bridge, and then after, it was cited that the bridge collapsed, or something along those lines. Listen, I've barely done much research, but enough to know that what is basically described is the gist of what happened. The way I would describe it is this being is called to be a bad omen. That relates to the incident that I'm about to tell you about, because it's the only thing that leads me back to believing that this is the same being that I saw. A couple of years back in the wintertime, I was visiting my brother, who didn't live far away from me, and he had become very ill. The doctors were not able to figure out what exactly was wrong with him, and his illness had taken him to such a depth that I had to start taking time off work to seriously help him out. He wasn't married and didn't have any kids, so him and I were really all each other had. Mom and Dad had passed away long ago, and we were still very close. His illness continued to get worse and worse, and he would have random bouts of night terrors, extreme vomiting, deliria. sometimes totally forgetting who he was and where he was at. He would fall unconscious at random times, appearing to have seizures. Blood tests, CT scans, you name it. Every test under the sun doctors ran on him, but nothing would come back conclusive. It was truly baffling. Doctors and nurses could not find anything wrong with him. He even tested for cancer, but came back negative on multiple occasions. Then, he went through a period where he seemed to be surprisingly getting much better, much faster than he was deteriorating. He was regaining his energy and strength like never before, and for the first time in a long while, I was able to be independent. I had visited him a couple times during this, and while he was regaining his strength back, it was at this point as I was leaving the house one evening that I saw what looked to be a tall black bat-like figure perched up on top of his chimney, staring down at me with bright red eyes. I don't know what I was looking at, or if I was having an hallucination or what, but I got out of my truck and I shook my fist at it and told it to get away from my brother. I thought it was a demon, but little would I know that it was truly coming for his life. I screamed at it, I cussed at it, I called it everything under the sun, and it just sat there, looking at me, and then in a flash of light, flew off. I've never felt so angry before. I understand you might consider my reaction crazy, because most people would not have reacted that way. Most people would have been terrified to see what I did. But the overwhelming feeling of this thing coming to prey on my weakest, sickly brother made me sick, even if his condition was drastically improving at the moment. Let me explain. I'm very overprotective over my brother, and always have been. I would find myself in bouts of bravery, even at times where normal people should have been terrified over the course of growing up. That involves high school bullies and other abusive situations between my father, him, and I. He's my flesh and blood, and I'll always love him, even if he is gone and in a better place. I would later on research and find out what it was that was on his chimney, and everything seemed to point to the whole Mothman phenomenon, which I had nothing on or any knowledge about. I do remember reading something about the whole Point Pleasant Bridge and it crashing, and just a bunch of other sightings of people have had in the time being. I think I've mainly brushed it off the time and tried not to think too much about it. I didn't care if I saw a supernatural being or not. I wasn't going to let it do anything to my brother, because honestly, that's the feeling I got from it. As soon as I looked into its eyes, into infinity, I couldn't shake the feeling, like it was the Grim Reaper coming for my brother's soul. A few days go by, and I get a call from one of his close friends who's at his house, telling me that his condition has suddenly decreased, and he needed to be transported to the hospital ASAP. Of course, I raced over there, doing all I could to take care of my brother, and we called an ambulance. He was taken to the hospital, where he had received great care, but his conditioning kept worsening. About 2 days later, he passed away in the hospital. Even his cause of death was unknown, and the doctors marked it as a natural cause. They conducted an autopsy, but reported nothing abnormal. His death was the hardest thing to ever have happened to me in my life, and I'm still not fully recovered from it. I don't think I ever will. You just don't recover from something like that. The meaning behind me telling you this isn't about the fact that I lost my brother. It's the fact that I want to know what I saw, and if it had anything to do with his sudden passing. You look at the Point Pleasant situation, and it appearing there was like an omen. Is this one of those superstitious situations where if you see the Mothman, something bad is going to happen? That's what I began to question, and my sanity has soon slipped away. I'm not sure about anything anymore, and no research I can find is truly concrete. I'm just asking you for answers, since you seem to know a lot about this kind of stuff and the paranormal. The only thoughts I can honestly confide in is that my brother is now in a more peaceful state. I don't know what mystery illness he had, or why he died when he did, even though he seemed to be getting better. But he's gone now, and I'm still fighting day after day to accept it. The best thing I could do at this point is to get answers as to what and why. Believe me, I know if I see the Mothman again, he's probably going to be coming back for me. and he ain't gonna win so easily. I won't let him. You might think I'm crazy, but I swear on what I say is truth. I do believe that I've been seeing this creature, what many call the Mothman, flying around at night around where I live. To make matters worse, many of my family has seen it too, and they all have their own stories. Of course, everybody's story and situation is different, but mine feels a little more terrifying. I've only ever seen it at night, and it only ever reveals itself by sitting on top of a tree or somewhere on top of my house, waiting for me to exit so it can terrify me. I've shot at it multiple times, but to no avail. Bullets don't even seem to bother this thing, and it never makes a sound. Even as it flies through the air or flaps its wings, nothing. Not even the air around it moving. It resembles that of a human with large wings, kind of like a bat. I've seen its face, and it looks more evil than some of the movies that I've seen on TV. I know deep down in my heart that this thing comes from the pits of hell, and I've done every ritual, every ward, every prayer to try and get rid of it, and nothing works. I don't know why it's stalking me and my family, but it seems intent on getting something that it wants. I just don't know what that is yet. It doesn't appear every night, but it shows itself often just to let me know that it's there. At night sometimes, I'll hear it walking around on my roof, and then it suddenly disappears, just as soon as it appeared. I can't even step outside at night for a cigarette without feeling this stifling thick feeling of something wrong. It's so thick in the air, you can cut it with a knife. I'll always know he's around because of the bitter feeling in my stomach, the uneasiness he gives off. It makes your hair stand up. Nothing can compare to the fear this thing emits. It doesn't attack though, nor has it ever tried to. That's the scariest part. It just waits and watches, as if it's waiting for something. Waiting for the right time to strike, or the right moment to act. It's calculating, its movements, it's strategizing. The way it watches me, watches my family. It's unnerving, and I know it's planning and plotting something. I've gone to pastors, I've gone to healers, I've gone to psychics. Nobody has a concrete answer as to what I'm dealing with. I burn sage and I place wards around my house, but it's like this being doesn't even seem to notice nor care. I fear I will never get rid of it till it finally gets what it wants. I live in the greater Chicago area, all the way out by myself. I'm far enough away from any neighbors that I'm more secluded, and I've even opened up the lines of dialogue between me and my neighbors and have asked them, regardless of them thinking I'm crazy, if they have had any similar experiences. Of course, none of them do, and don't know what I'm talking about. It either makes them a liar, or they are in denial. It makes me feel even worse, because I know whatever this is solely targeting me and my family. Listen, I don't know if you know anything about what I'm going through, but I'm desperate. Maybe it wants my soul. Maybe it wants me dead. I don't know. All I know is that this thing is on a mission, and it's not going to stop until it gets what it wants. I just hope that what it wants isn't me, or any one of my family members. My grandparents had passed away within a few months of each other, leaving their house empty. There was talk of renting it out initially, but because of its poor state of disrepair, the family decided against it. No consensus about what to do with it could be arrived at. Therefore, it would be left to decay for another decade or more before I would stumble upon it. My aunt and I were going through my mother's things and discovered an old family photo album. Mom had gone off on one of her journeys, and no one was sure if she'd ever return. Her and I had been having an on and off relationship for years, so there was a lot about the family I didn't know. I came across a picture of her and I when I was just a baby, but I didn't recognize the house we were standing in front of. I inquired and my aunt told me about the old Wheeler family house that had once belonged to her parents. No one had been there in over a decade, and she wasn't even sure it was still standing. So, after a half an hour of badgering, she agreed to take me out to see it That following morning, we headed out of town through 30 miles of cornfields until we came to a turnoff that led down a long, weedy gravel road. As we crested the hill, I was taken aback. The house I saw before me, despite being run down, was still breathtaking. In its prime, it must have been the finest home in the county. My aunt pulled up within a few yards of it, and we got out. From what I could see, nobody but the occasional mowing company had been there in a very long time. I couldn't help but be in awe of the place. The vibrant pink and blue paint had long faded from its soaring towers and the massive porch that was beginning to sag in a few places. Before I entered, I wanted to take in every bit of the wonderful facade as I could. Around the back was the remnants of the old horseshoe pit, and what I was told, my grandfather's Ford pickup. Although the big house had long seen its best days, I knew I hadn't seen anything that could have compared. Maybe one of those beautiful Victorian mansions in San Francisco. Even those would be dwarfed in comparison to this. When I was ready, we climbed the concrete steps and entered through the back entrance. From the moment we cracked the door, we were overwhelmed by a hideous smell coming from inside. We assumed it was a normal part of having a house sealed for so long and continued with our search. Everything appeared as if it had just been left where it was on my grandmother's last day, almost like a time capsule or a museum. The lights were even still working. Only later did I discover that my mother had been paying the bills all these years in hopes somebody would return and live there someday. Walking from room to room and seeing all the beautiful antique furnishing, I couldn't stop wondering why I had never been told about the house. Regardless of our frequent estrangements, I would have helped my mother with the upkeep of it. It was downright insane to me to leave such a beautiful place to rot. Then again, my mother's strange ways were the main reason of our frequent falling outs. As we made our way to the second floor, the smell only got worse. I suggested we cut our visit short and just take a quick look around. Every door was closed, so I went for the closest one and stuck my head in. This must have been a guest room or spare. Upon the bed laid a beautiful and elaborate, quite easily over 100 years old. My aunt was going through a cedar chest in the room next to me. I joined her, and we discovered another, much older photo album and decided to bring it back with us to look at later. She closed the door behind us, and I made my way toward the last room. Unfortunately, the closer I got to the door, the stronger the smell got. I was reluctant to open it, but I thought if the poor critter was where I could get to it, I'd take it outside and give it a good burial. Cracking the door, the stench slapped me in the face, and I lost focus for a moment. When I regained my composure, I was met with a terrible sight. Before me was not a dead forest creature, but a human being. The bloated body, now unrecognizable, laid curled up, slightly on the bed. I could feel my knees begin to buckle, so I turned as quickly as possible away and out of the room. My aunt was confused by my behavior and stuck her head in before yanking it out quickly again. We both ran down the stairs where the smell was less potent, and I called 911. The officers spent a few minutes in the room before coming back out with a small piece of paper and a driver's license. One of them joined us at the table where we were sitting and asked a few questions about my mother. This made me nervous, and I began demanding he explain himself. A serious look came across his face, and he told us that the body appeared to belong to my mother. I didn't want to believe it at first, but when he handed me her license, I knew it was true. My aunt and I held each other for a long time and cried. The officer gave us a few moments before interjecting himself again. Then he asked me if I knew why she would take her own life. I had naturally assumed Mom had died in her sleep. She was an older woman, but the note he handed me made everything clear. She had been depressed for a long time because of our being at odds with each other, and the last time we spoke, some things were said she feared she couldn't take back. The morning after our argument, she decided to return to the only place she'd ever been happy. Although she claimed to not be sure of what she was going to do at the time, the poor state of house just sent her over the edge. The last sentence asked that I not blame myself for her death, and that I move on with my life. The ending read simply, Goodbye, Mom. A couple of weeks later, after everybody had time to deal with their grief, I brought the remaining family members together. After seeing the old house and realizing how poor the condition of it and that it hurt my mother, I proposed that we try to raise the money to renovate it. In light of what had just occurred, I wanted to, at least, try to create something positive from our tragedy. I was giving their blessing and went to work. It took some time, but on the first day of spring, 2018, the Historical Society allowed me to lead the first tour of the newly restored Wheeler Mansion. A great day could have been much better had my mother been there with me. No matter our differences, it was her who inspired me and the only one who truly made it all possible. For the hunting season of 2017, I got in on a lease with a guy from work. I didn't have time to check the area out before the season started, so the inevitable occurred and I got lost my first day. That morning, I left the camp just before dawn. I'm not the kind that hunts from a stand. I'm your traditional stalk and shoot type of hunter. Since I wasn't familiar with the lease and I, stupidly, left my GPS back at the camp, I had to stick to the main paths in order to not get lost. Most of the morning, I did well. However, as I grew tired, I lost focus and veered from the trail. In my defense, I came across this really fresh set of tracks. Of course I had to follow them. The sucky thing was that they continued onto a neighboring property, and I had to stop following. When I looked up, I realized I was way off the trail, and I did not know how to get back. The rest of the day was spent trying to find my way back to camp. About an hour before dark, I noticed a rundown house or cabin in the distance. By now, I wasn't sure whose property I was on. I hoped that if somebody was living there, they could help me. But as I got closer, I could tell the place had been abandoned for a good while. I knocked to make sure, but with no reply, I made myself at home. My first goal was to get a fire going. After I did that, I began combing through the cabinets for food or other things that I thought could help me. Not much, but a questionable can of chili and some candles were found. I heated up the chili over the fire and combined it with a half-eaten bag of chips. After dinner, I looked through the bedroom and discovered an old map of the area. I wasn't sure how accurate it would be after all that time, but I was happy to find it. I spread it out on the floor in front of the fireplace and planned my course for the morning. I was shocked to see I had veered off over 5 miles from where I'd started. At some point, I must have dozed off. During the night, I had a super vivid dream that a man was sitting in the chair next to me, just staring. The guy never said a word. When I jerked awake and saw that I was alone, I was relieved and quickly fell back asleep. The following morning, I woke up at 6:15 and got my stuff together. I made sure the fire was completely put out and headed back to camp. I just stepped out from the house when I came face to face with a strange man. The guy from my dream, in fact. I was confused at first, but when he spoke, I knew my dream had really happened. This man was holding an old Marlin 30-30, not an odd sight for a hunter during deer season. This dude did not look like a hunter though. He wore old dirty backpack and normal bright yet dingy street clothes. His eyes had a very crazed look to them that made me uncomfortable to gaze at. I was surprised but regained my calm and said, "Good morning." Instead of saying it back, he just stared at me with his crazed black eyes. I began to say something else, but he interrupted and asked what I was doing in the cabin. Before I could answer, he blurted out that it was his place. I continued and explained what had happened the day before. The entire time I was telling him, he was gripping the rifle so tightly, his knuckles were white. His behavior was beginning to scare me. The only thing I wanted to do was go back to camp and then home. The last word had barely left my lips before he angrily told me that it was his place. It appeared to have been empty for quite a while, but I wasn't going to argue with him. I apologized as quickly as I could and went on my way. For a good 100 yards or more, I kept looking behind me. I was waiting to get shot in the back. Every time I looked back, he was staring, maniacally, back at me, death gripping his gun. It took a couple of hours for me to find my way back, By then, I'd have plenty of time to dwell upon our encounter, and I was fully freaked out. The guys that were still in camp were happy to see me and asked what had happened. I just said I got lost and camped out for the night, never mentioning the nutcase I met. I doubt they'd take it seriously anyhow. The whole experience had me so scared I wanted nothing more than to get home. The other guys must have thought I was crazy. After throwing all my stuff into the back of my truck, I tore off out of there and never returned. I knew I'd never be able to feel safe knowing that Kook was somewhere out in the woods, possibly watching me. That following Monday, my friend asked what had caused me to leave so abruptly. I had made up some lie about my wife being sick. I'm not sure he believed it. Nothing was said about it again, and maybe things are better that way. I was 17 when I had my first encounter with something strange. I was hiking through some tall brush near my mother's house, about an hour south of Los Angeles, when I saw something weird moving up a hill. I saw an animal, as I later discovered, or maybe not an animal. It was walking on two legs, but looked like a cricket-looking thing. I kid you not. At first, I thought it was a man in an insect costume or something. It was so strange. It had the tiniest little appendages coming out of its back that were about a foot long each. This creature also appeared to have antennae. It was also slowly moving up this large hill, but moving very strangely. It scared me, so I ran back to my house and didn't say anything to my mother. She wouldn't have believed me anyway. I was smoking a lot of weed throughout my time at my mom's at that time, so she probably would have attributed it to that. But I tell you what, no amount of weed is going to make you see what I did. As the day wore on, I received a very strange call from a friend. He called my house later on in the afternoon, saying he was out on a trail in San Fernando Valley and that I would never believe what he had seen. My friends all grew up in West Hollywood, so I know they've seen some things, but this was something much different. To my horror, he told me over the phone that he saw this insectoid-like creature, describing it to the T what I just saw hours prior to that happening. I started panicking over the phone and told him what I had seen earlier that day and that it was the same thing he saw. He got quiet. The silence was broken with him saying that at least he knows that we're both not crazy. Not much was said after that. He always confided in me to tell me very personal things, so I had no doubts he was telling the honest truth. It disturbed me, is what it did, considering I just seen the same creature he had only hours before. The burning question remains, what are these creatures? I saw an insect mantis type of creature. It was in the remote wilderness of Illinois, a place I know very little about. I was trying to do some hiking on foot. I pulled into a campsite that had been long abandoned. No people, nothing. Just the old remains of a bonfire, and the occasional crow or raven around. One of these creatures stepped out of the woods and looked around. It was huge. It was quite tall, with what appeared to be a kind of crest on the top of its head. It also had a long, black, rubbery-like tail that reached out about 3 feet from behind the creature. I was terrified, but it didn't appear to notice me. It's like it came out of the woodline and not knew that I was there. This was basically a man-sized mantis-like creature. I was not a trained outdoor expert or anything, and in my naivety, I had probably just walked in on this thing's territory. It was a bit too much to handle. I hid behind a spot in the trees and waited for it to enter a new area of woods before running back to my car and vomiting. The sight of this thing just made me sick. It felt wrong, everything. Even from the moment I pulled up to this camp spot, something felt off, and I knew it. Every year, my family has this huge throwdown barbecue just outside of Houston, Texas, where they live, where all of the family flies down for the weekend and parties. By party, I mean eat lots of smoked barbecued meat, drink beer, and spend time catching up with one another, with copious amounts of wine and other good food. This occurs in the month of July, but this year, because of COVID, our annual event has been canceled. Sigh. So, I'm going to use this opportunity to tell you about something very strange that really weirded me out last year that this happened. So, 2019, we all fly down there. We meet up with everybody. My family's house, well, it's more like an estate because it's a mansion. It's seriously massive. They run a very successful auto business, so they have buku bucks. So there's room for about every one of us to sleep in our own guest bedroom very comfortably. We have a humongous barbecue pit with lots of drinks, wine, beer, alcohol, anything, and plenty of good times. They have tons of acreage and own probably about 50 plus, with just thick forests, lagoons, creeks and rivers, and what have you. When you get there, you almost just want to go on an adventure. They actually have a few golf carts just sitting around for you to get in and drive around the property, due to its sheer size. Look, I love drinking beer and I love eating food as much as anybody, but I really love fishing. The lagoon they have on the back side of their property is one of the coolest spots. It's actually privatized, so they do all their own fishing there. I've been going to it for years every summer when I'm there for the weekend to check it out, and I always try and squeeze in some fishing if I can, even if it's just a session or two. Sometimes it's harder than others, but this time I was determined. Like I said, you had to take a golf cart to even get back to the little pathway that leads out to the lagoon. Then, you take a small trail that's probably only a few hundred yards to a decent-sized lagoon tucked away in the forest. Like I said, it's all private, so we don't have to worry about any other people coming there or competing with anybody. I think there's mainly just small bass and trout, and maybe a few other types of smaller fish. Nothing magnificent or worth bragging about, but it sure is peaceful. I'm going to be honest with you too. Sometimes I don't want to be hanging around noisy drunk family all the time for the whole weekend. I'm a huge fan of solace and quiet, and there ain't nothing more peaceful than sitting by yourself for hours with your line casted into the water. Thankfully, because of how rich my family is, I didn't have to worry about bringing any of my own fishing equipment. They had a shed nearby dedicated to just housing rods, lines, and lures that I was able to borrow and use anytime I pleased. My family uses this lagoon often for their own private fishing, and it actually feeds into a couple other smaller rivers around the area. I think much of the acreage here that goes on is just undeveloped forest and part of the lagoon. It's not a giant lagoon by any means, but it's relatively good size, and good sized enough that I can't see the end of it, just because it trails off behind the woods and the trees. So I'm sitting there on this little bridge with my line in the water, just enjoying the peace and calm and quiet. I'm close enough to my family and to where I can hear them gut laughing, and I knew in that instant they were already intoxicated. They usually don't get that loud and boisterous until they've had some alcohol in their system. Inebriation is a funny thing. As much as I like to be included in their shindig, I do like solitude, so I was very much enjoying this introverted me time. I wasn't getting a bite like I usual, which is not normal. I've had times of fishing where I wouldn't get a bite for hours, but the past few times I've fished at this lagoon, it's usually stocked full of fish, and wouldn't have to wait too long before I got a nibble. That's when I began to feel that I was being watched, and started feeling really uncomfortable. I ignored it at first, and just kept my focus on the line in the water, but the feeling began to grow stronger, to the point to where I could no longer ignore it. I started looking around, seeing if maybe any family had crept up on me and was trying to play games. Nobody had come around, and that's when I noticed the forest around the lagoon had grown deathly silent. See, that's generally not a good sign, and everything in my insides was telling me I should probably leave. My reasoning and logical brain kept trying to tell me that this is nonsense, and there's nothing wrong. Even though my skin was virtually crawling, I couldn't help but shake the feeling. That's when I saw it for the first time. A little ways off the bridge, to the right, and poking itself out halfway the forest, was what I can only describe to you as an insect-like creature. I know that probably doesn't make any sense to you, but this thing was probably about 8 to 9 feet tall, huge, hulking, and resembled that of a praying mantis in a way. It was much uglier though. It reminded me if you crossed a xenomorph from the Alien movies and a praying mantis. It didn't have that xenomorph alien-like head though that you would see in the movies, but instead just a hideous insectoid-looking head. It even had the praying mantis-like claws where they fold in, and it was standing there on 2 legs. It had these bright yellow eyes, but it was staring at me, and it looked very insect-like. As soon as I made eye contact with it, I knew that it knew that I saw it, and I could feel the evil and hatred emanating from this thing. You know how when you make eye contact with somebody, and you could almost feel into their soul? Well, that's what I felt in that moment. It's like it was communicating to me that it was going to hurt me and kill me. In that moment, I threw down my rod and I ran. Got the golf cart and drove up to the house and stayed there. I was freaked out. I didn't know what to do or who to talk to. Parts of my family thought I was acting strange and wondering why I was not joining in the rest of the family during the times of eating and drinking, but I just used the good old excuse that I wasn't feeling well and I was sick. I never told any of my family what really happened or what I saw, just because they probably wouldn't believe me anyway. I'm no stranger to people talking about seeing weird stuff out in the woods, like Bigfoot, or even the occasional staircase in the middle of nowhere. But I sure as hell ain't heard nobody ever talk about insect creatures taller than me with bright glowing yellow eyes. Certainly, that was a new one. Maybe that has to do with the lagoon and why it felt different that day. There's also more fog than usual, and things in general just felt off. Maybe that's the reason why the fish weren't really biting. I know skinwalkers and shapeshifters are a very common theme in Navajo culture and tradition, but I've had friends in multiple tribes and have been all over the U.S., and the whole shapeshifter tale has been a common, reoccurring theme throughout many tribes, even in some parts of Canada that are more remote. Before I go on, I'm a crypto researcher, and so I've been able to make friends in many places. The stories I've gotten here have been incredible, and I really appreciate what you're doing on your channel by spreading the truth about these things being out there. Not just shapeshifters, all of them. Today, I wanted to share some shapeshifter accounts with you, since you do so many skinwalker-based stories. I'm sure you are familiar with what they are, who they are, and that they are strongly rooted in Navajo legend. While their intentions might be evil, they still have the tendency to abuse shape-shifting for the common end goal of black magic. A friend of mine who I've gotten to know over the years, who happens to be a mix of a few tribes, but is strongly Sioux. His grandfather and forefathers had tales of old men, hermits actually, that would live alone in the woods. Anytime they were ever approached by opposing tribes or people they didn't know, they would shapeshift into a deer, a bird, or even a wolf. Now the skinwalkers in Navajo culture would primarily shapeshift into coyotes for the sake of instilling fear and harm on individuals. These shapeshifters were different. I'm not sure the type of magic they would practice, but it wasn't necessarily nefarious. These hermits wanted to be left alone, and would shapeshift whatever they needed to be to avoid human contact. This is more common than you think. As this friend of mine explained to me, there were several tales from his tribe of multiple hermits and people doing this. Of course, they had their fair share of black magic practices, who also shapeshifted to instill fear and malevolent gain. I feel like that's just a part of life. Some people are good, and some people are evil. What interested me the most is that there is so much shape-shifting lore in many of these people's cultures. For the longest time, I gained friends in other tribes. I was stuck to my belief that it was just a Navajo-exclusive thing. Now, I know different. Another friend of mine, who I became very close with when I was going on several different Bigfoot expeditions down in Southern California, is from a tribe down there. If you do decide to use this and record this, and he is listening, forgive me for I forget the name of their tribe, but he told me about what he was as a very young boy, that there was a pack of ravenous wolves that came in and invaded their small village and killed several men, women, and children. This pack of ravenous wolves was actually a small band of evil shapeshifters that would shapeshift into wolves to rape, steal, and kill. It was said that this small band of shapeshifters were evil men that were cast out of other tribes and villages for the evil deeds they committed to others. So basically, a small group of bandits that were shapeshifters. They were later captured and burned alive. Their remains were scattered and dumped into the rivers from what I was told, doing a sacred ritual, a cleansing ritual. The man who told me about this is in his 70s, possibly older, but because of his culture, they are usually in very great health and of sound mind. Many of their people don't make up stories for the purpose of notoriety. They have nothing to gain out of it, no incentive to feed me made-up stories. He can remember them being burned alive as he witnessed it as just a young boy. This same man can also recall an elder when he was a boy who had left the tribe to go live in isolation. This older man also shapeshifted, but kept it a secret. He would often come and keep an eye on the village to protect it in the form of a bird. He said the bird would come, or the old man, and would watch over the children, the tribe's most vulnerable. The reason for this elder leaving the tribe to go live in isolation was that he was going to go and die by himself, but in reality, he had to hide his powers in some way. Personally, I don't know too much about that particular story because he didn't go into great detail. This is also a gentleman that I got the pleasure of sitting down with and discussing with him other findings I've received of other tribes, like Sioux and Navajo. I think the biggest thing he was surprised to hear is that there is so much magic that is practiced in other tribes and cultures. Growing up in the area, he had very little contact, if any, with any other tribes, let alone neighboring tribes. Information like this was new to him. These were not by far the craziest stories I've ever been told about shapeshifting. Years back, I was told about a few warriors from a tribe on the East Coast who would shapeshift and hunt large predators to store back plenty of food for the winter. I don't know if they would do this in secrecy or if it was common knowledge among their tribe of people. Apparently, this particular tribe went through a really bad period of famine and turned to magic to feed their people. Only the strongest and wisest warriors among the tribe were hand-selected to learn these secrets to provide food for their entire tribe. They would shapeshift into bears or wolves from what I would gather and would go hunt those same animals. They would come back with even more abundant amounts of food to feed their tribe for the entire winter. Going back to Navajo and their culture, I've gotten to listen to many accounts and witness stories of skinwalkers, some far more terrifying than you could ever imagine. I've also heard of good skinwalkers, if that even makes sense. These are skinwalkers that were, I would call, rogue walkers. They were once evil and still maintained their demonic power, but decided to place that power out on other skinwalkers. Meaning, they wouldn't prey on innocent people any longer, but instead took their revenge out on other skinwalkers who preyed upon good people. I guess even after converting to the dark, some people can have a drastic change of heart. In the land of Navajo, whom I've also acquired many friends throughout the years, have expressed their concern for the unnatural animals that they've seen out there. They believe these to also be shapeshifters, but not necessarily skinwalkers. See, skinwalkers primarily take the form of coyotes and other animals, but I do know for a fact that it's mainly coyotes and other grotesque forms. They believe there's other shapeshifters at large that aren't exactly skinwalkers. They have reported seeing very large black panther-like cats roaming around, with evil intentions, scaring and chasing those who come across them. They are demonic and to be warded away, I was told. They've also encountered pitch-black grizzly-sized bears out in the middle of the night, something I hadn't heard of until a few family members came to me with their own sightings and stories. Thinking logically, there are of course black bears in most parts of the U.S. to my knowledge, but when they go and use descriptions talking about their gargantuan size and ill intention, it really sets me in a bad place. This tells me there are far more than just skinwalkers out and about, but some who enlist the use of dark magic to aid them has many possibilities on their ability to harm individuals. The grizzly-sized bears they've been seeing also have distinct markings on them, having more humanoid features. Having either a panther or a large evil bear running after your car down the highway at night is equally terrifying, especially when they can keep up with you at 70 to 80 miles an hour. You know there is something bad at work there. An ex-reservation officer I had the pleasure of meeting spoke to me about how there was a smaller family that lived in the outskirts of the res many years ago that had been murdered apparently. Their bodies were then drug out to the middle of the desert and feasted upon. When they were found by the reservation police, there wasn't much left of them. They weren't devoured on by coyotes either, or birds. The chunks of meat taken out of them were large and still had bite marks on the intact parts of their leftover bodies. They attributed this to shapeshifters. This wasn't the only time this happened either. Throughout his time there as an officer, he had been witness to other bizarre happenings that were very similar. Driving at night, responding to a call, and seeing a grown man running on the highway next to his police vehicle doing 60 miles an hour. A grown man running on all fours and then turning into a wolf before his very eyes. This man has had to defend himself with his firearm against these things. One time in particular, he shot at this massive panther that attacked him when he was off duty. It nearly killed him just before he could fire off a few good shots at it and drove it away. This officer explained that shapeshifters have a few distinct features about them that you'll know it's them. The first being is that they have a human look to their faces, even if they have fully shifted into an animal. The second is that they will have various markings or scars along their body or face. The markings comment is probably one of the first few times I've heard that, but that's what he said from his experiences. This man has had his fair share of dancing with death from these beings alone. The worst, he said, were the bears, because of how much damage they would cause to people, structures, and carcasses. This kind of stuff happens far more often than we would all like to believe. When you're cozy in a little suburban neighborhood, at work at your bank or store, you never have to think about these things. These aren't real problems for us, but for these people, it's a life-threatening thing they have to deal with constantly and consistently. Even if these people aren't dealing with the evil persons who abuse magic to use this, shape-shifting is still very much a part of their culture and who they are as people. Some tribes it's more sacred than others. Stories and opinions will vary greatly depending on where you travel to and what tribe you speak to. I'll do what I can to gather up more stories for you and share them. I truly believe that what I saw that day was indeed something real. This happened to me back when I was just a teenager. I was 14 and visiting extended family in Missouri. They kind of live out in the sticks, so it took a while to get all of us out there. All the meanwhile, my father getting lost a few times just trying to find it. After we had, our plan was to stay there for about a week and then move on to go see my grandfather and grandmother who live in upstate New York. While we were here, I had some cousins that I hadn't seen since I was very little, so reconnecting with long-forgotten family was very great. I do remember that one evening, we were out there at nighttime. We had a big bonfire out in the backyard. My cousins that I hadn't seen in forever were telling me spooky stories, trying to scare me, but I wasn't buying it. Then we got onto the topic of exploring, and they got onto the topic of Bigfoot. I wasn't a believer in Bigfoot, so again, didn't scare me at all. Then they start talking about zombies, and that's when they start mentioning that there's an old gravesite just beyond the trees somewhere down the way. It's a very old gravesite that has been there long before this house was ever built. Instead of being demolished, it was just kind of left there, and the forest grew around it. They kind of pulled the whole pet cemetery vibe, you know, where you can bring a dead cat and bury it there, and it's supposed to come back with some evil magic or something like that. But again, I wasn't buying it. However, the thought of exploring an uncharted, spooky graveyard did pique my interest, and I asked them if we can go see it. They kept making comments like, yeah, but you're going to be scared, and the Bigfoot will get you. I couldn't count the times that I rolled my eyes. It just became a passing conversation, and we ended up moving on to different things, and the days went by before the whole gravesite thing would ever be brought up again. I believe it was a few nights later, when a couple of my cousins were getting ready to go on a night hike, and they asked me if I wanted to join in and to go show me the gravesite. At this time, I had completely forgotten all about it. I was excited, so of course I said yes. My father and my mother were very lenient people, not to mention forgiving, and I was 14, so I don't think they really could care. They wanted to make sure I had the proper flashlights and equipment and what have you. Luckily for me, my extended family was also partial pack rats, so we had everything from headlamps to big mag flashlights that the cops used to use. Don't ask me how they acquired all this stuff. I think they hunted garage sales like madmen and bought as much as they could. They were what I'd like to call preppers, so they weren't short on anything survival related. It was me and 3 of my other cousins, and we decided midnight would be the perfect time to go out. I can remember that night pretty vividly. It was so dark with all the cloud coverage, and there wasn't much light. It's probably a good thing that we had high-quality flashlights. We had to cross a couple large pastures and through about half a mile of woods. During the trip, I remember complaining, saying that this is further than you guys made it seem, while giving me the whole, it's just a bit further rhetoric. I'm sure you've all heard that one before, when somebody tells you something is just right there. They were right though. When we got to it, it was incredibly hard to notice at first, because things have been so overgrown. This gravesite was so old that we couldn't really find any information on it at first. There was a big stone slab in front that had been taken over by the years of growth in the forest, but the writing was so worn away. It was illegible. The gravesite was smaller than I expected it to be. Maybe 30 graves in total, with some not having much of a tombstone left at all. Most names we saw had been so weathered away that we had a hard time making out dates and names, but a couple of the dates we saw were in the 1800s. The whole gravesite felt forgotten about, as if we had stumbled onto an old relic of time. The forest was so thick on all the surrounding sides of the gravesite. Massive pine trees and thick brush pretty much kept all visibility nil. The trees were so tall around here that I'm sure even during the day, there probably wasn't a whole lot of room for daylight. We spent a little bit of time going through the site from grave to grave, seeing what we could find for information, and to get a real feel for how old this place really is. There wasn't really much of a fence or bordering, at least anything that was left. This was pretty primitively built, so whenever this gravesite was erected, it probably didn't have a whole lot of money put into it. This would lead me to believe that this gravesite was probably owned by somebody extremely poor. In fact, the most expensive things that were on the gravesite were probably the tombstones, and even these were falling apart and eroded away from heavy weathering. There was a single stone, though, that had been set apart from the other stones, which was one of the last graves we were going to go check out. It was larger than the rest, and kind of in a weird circular shape I had never seen. We figured it might have been somebody important. This grave was also away from the rest of the graves by probably about 20 to 30 feet in its own little area. Potentially an owner of the land, a mayor, somebody of power. This gravestone had much less erosion than the other ones, and in fact, the writing on it was even much more legible as well. The thing that was odd to me and all of us was the gravestone didn't have a name, but I'll never forget what it said. Master of Coven, Priest of Black. We kind of chuckled to ourselves, saying, "What? What does that mean?" The date was from 1806 to 1890. We decided to spend a little more time looking around before calling it a night, but there really wasn't much left to look at. As we're gathering ourselves, getting ready to leave, we began to hear what sounded like heavy wings flapping. Then, The most horrendous feeling hit us like a fist to the gut. Everything around us went from calm to downright terrifying. I never have gone from calm to complete and utter fear in such a short amount of time in my life. We're hearing these wings flap, and it sounded extremely close by, up in the trees. We all looked at each other, confused, because we're wondering what kind of bird that's this large is flying around at this time of night. We heard the loud crash of something very large standing on a thick branch around us. We shined our lights around to see what was there, and not even 50 feet away from us, on a branch, was this gargoyle-looking creature glaring at us. When we flashed our lights, it spread its wings and gave us this vicious scream like it was there to kill us. It's important for me to really describe to you just how ugly this thing was. This thing was massive and had to have been easily the size of a lion, if not bigger. I mean, it was huge, and sitting up on this top thick branch, probably 16 or more inches in diameter if I had to guess. I mean, any thinner of a branch, and there's no way that a branch would have held the weight of whatever this was. It looked just like a gargoyle, but much more evil. It was very smoky charcoal gray in skin color, and we all can recall the faint smell of a sulfur-like smell. It had piercing red eyes and millions of jagged, pointed teeth. It must have been watching us. I don't know where it came from or how it got there, but it was one of the most awful experiences I've had. It spreading its wings at us like it did and screaming at us gave me nightmares for years afterward. It was total evil. We all screamed louder than we ever have and took off running back to the house faster than any of us have ever ran before. Making it back to the house in record time, my cousins were checking behind us constantly to see if we had been followed by that thing. After making it into the house, we weren't quiet about at all what happened. We're screaming and sobbing, waking up just about every other adult in the process. My parents and family freaked the heck out. Here are a bunch of teenagers, 14 and 19, crying like babies and shaking over what we all just saw. There were 4 of us to attest to all seeing the same thing. Surprisingly, our parents and family actually kind of believed us, and I will say, thank the Lord for all 4 of us seeing it versus just one. I do believe it added so much more validity and credibility to our story. Our parents just hugged us and comforted us. We eventually calmed down, but we all slept in the living room that night, after being awake for hours and hours. I mean, you don't easily go to sleep after something horrendous like that. The next morning came and went, and we never really talked about it again. It was never brought back up on that trip, and things sort of returned to normal for the remainder of short time we were there. There was no more mentioning hikes out in the woods or anything like that. We just didn't talk about it. My one cousin, though, was really quiet after it, and he didn't speak much or show much emotion the following days. I think we all processed trauma and fear differently. I respected it. It wasn't until later on in the years to come that we would talk about the event again in passing and learn more details here and there. Later on, I learned that a coven is actually kind of a secret group of witches that conduct witchcraft. They're generally ruled by a high priestess and a high priest, or sometimes one or the other. Sometimes same-sex couples as well. Whoever this person remained nameless, but they were clearly the leader of a witch's coven. I think we stumbled upon a coven gravesite that was potentially family-ran. I'm not too sure, since I tried to research a sentence and haven't been able to find anything on it. Whatever demonic being we saw that night is what I believe to be the guardian of that gravesite. You think with that kind of graveyard, it would possess some sort of off-putting demonic energy or bad feelings, but it didn't. I don't recall feeling anything out of place until that one moment of extreme fear. Listen, I know my story sounds crazy and probably made up, or like some sort of rookie horror fiction story, but it happened to me, and I don't really tell a lot of people because most will write me off. I have to live with the experience, and I figured telling people like you who could share my story would be the best way to overcome it and to live with it. Edit. In the future. Hi, I emailed you a few months back about the gargoyle encounter that I believe I had encountered in my teens. I had expressed to you at the time that my firm belief was that this creature was the guardian of this family coven, or some sort of small operated coven. Well, since I emailed you that story, I reached out to my extended family that still lives over on that property, and I was able to get a little more information on it. Apparently they know a lot more about it than I did. What happened is, long ago, one of the first few settling families that had started developing the land there and living there had formed a secret coven together, in which they would practice black magic. It was actually a band of about 4 or 5 families, with the family that owned my relative's property being the main ones operating the coven. It was run by a lone man, whom they called the Black Priest, and he operated all things within this coven. The graves in that area are all from those families that participated in this coven of witchcraft. Not all family members served in the coven, but it sounds like most did. We couldn't find much about the nitty-gritty details other than that there was heavy witchcraft going on. But I couldn't find anything conclusive, like on sacrificial rituals or things like that. I was never able to find out the head priest's name either, the one whom ran the coven. It sounds like he and the coven kept on the down low pretty well and operated entirely underground. Not literally underground, just secretive. He is actually still buried there today, along with much of his family and the other families that served in that coven. Then, I guess as the years went by after he passed, much of the coven split up and fell apart, with the remaining practicers operating in smaller covens. But he was actually one of the last ones to die and wanted to be placed at that gravesite. After he had passed, his family passed the land on to other owners who decided to leave the gravesite as is, and the land just grew around it for a long time. It was kind of just left abandoned. It borders state game land now, but the gravesite itself falls into that relative's property, so it's just been left there, left to rot and be forgotten to time. After the ownership had been passed on, it had finally gotten passed on a couple of more times, where my relative's house was then built and used for farming or other stuff, but that entire forest and forest area was left completely intact and untouched. I believe my relatives bought it right before the Great Depression in the 20s, and it's been there since. They've been updating the house ever since they've had it, since it's a house that's been in our generation for a long time. The grave site is not incredibly far back there, maybe half a mile, and with how much overgrowth there was, you wouldn't just be able to see it and go right to it. It could have been very easily missed if you didn't know it was there. Sorry, I'm not trying to make this email long, I just wanted you to have more information on my story. I wouldn't be shocked if he had placed some sort of hex or voodoo spell over that place to have some sort of demonic guardian watch over their eternal resting spot. With the witchcraft, who knows? Anyway, the whole thing still gives me the chills thinking about it. I was around 22 to 23 years old when this happened. I'm a woman living in Southeast Asia, and around here, witch doctors and witchcraft is widely known. When somebody says they went to a witch doctor to get healed, it was acceptable, and people just nodded unless they're a skeptic themselves, which is rare. With that said, there was a lot of belief in the supernatural and curses in this area. There was a time where my girlfriend used to somewhat live at our house days at a time. She would go home on weekends to get new clothes and come right back. Her family situation was bad, and getting her out of there eases the stress on both of us. In our house stayed my mom, little sister, our maid who had been with us since I was in high school, and then me and my girlfriend. When our maid was new to us, she was attentive, the type who handed us drinks on a saucer plate or coaster if available. And she probably thought we were a snob family, unlike her last, which was untrue, as we were still a casual middle type family. In our country, maids or domestic helpers are very common, and you don't have to be that rich to afford their services. And most maids are stay-in, which was the case for ours. She's an unmarried woman, around her late 30s, and based from the years of observation and experience with her, she's a spiteful woman. She's manipulative to everyone by saying that, "Your mom told me that you should," or "She said that," then something that she wanted you to do or believe. She's never taking responsibility or blame for anything she's ever said if the other person didn't tell her, or tell her others' command or sentence. This caused a lot of problems between me and my mom before that almost led to me to kill myself. I was almost successful if the belt didn't get loose from the tie I made. It was that bad. But she still does this to this day, using the name of another person to do her bidding. Don't ask me why she's still with us. If I have the power to choose, she had been long gone. But my mother is too nice, and her argument is, at least she's not a thief. We can deal with her attitude. Our maid also lies a lot to my aunt, who lives next door. She tells them stories of how my girlfriend asks her to wash her dirty laundry, which was false, because we don't want to ask her to do that, as to not get any bad rep in the first place, because we know that she would say things like these. But she did anyway, along with other lies that my girlfriend eats our food, empty the fridge and stuff like that. And, stupidly enough, my aunt believed her. This caused my aunt to give a scolding to my girlfriend that made her confidence and self-esteem go down even more, and she was already suffering enough with depression and anxiety. When the opportunity came for my girlfriend to get a job, she took it. At first, the workplace was near our home, so the commute was okay, but then they got relocated to a city about 2 hours away and even farther from her own home. So again, she opted to stay at my place because it was closer. Of course, our maid didn't like that at all, because it was another person to serve in her mind. Not sure why though, as we mostly kept to ourselves beside the food prep. My girlfriend, let's call her L, has diagnosed mild depression and anxiety, but her anxiety was at peak at this point, and this was the time I got a lot of phone calls from emergency services and ambulances to pick her up because she was panicking, hyperventilating, crying, and fighting to escape the paramedics. A part of her anxiety was she could never be around a crowd or near a stranger, as she was scared they would suddenly hurt her. One time, she was held up at a train station control room because the train she was in was packed and had a breakdown. She attempted to end it all and jump in the tracks, and everyone there didn't know what to do. I went and picked her up and called her manager to let her know she won't be coming to work that day. She went to work once and got a termination letter that same day. She went home crying and panicking as she told me that. The exit interview as per company procedures scheduled a few days after never happened, as we waited with her, me and a friend at the office. The person that was conducting the interview said the meeting was at 11 p.m., and we got there at 10, as we didn't want to be late. A few hours went by and we kept asking the lady behind the desk if the person was there, and she said that it was, but in a meeting or some sort. So okay. We waited a few more hours, but when it reached 3 a.m., we had had enough, and Elle's anxiety was peaking. We left the office without speaking to the interviewer. Elle tried to jump from the 3rd floor that night, and we held her back. It was her anger issue and anxiety kicking in. By the time we got out of the building, she was hyperventilating, and guards patrolling the area thought she was on drugs, as she was curling on the floor, having an attack. I told them to stay away, as she needed the space to calm down. They did, and left us be. We were also back and forth to the mental institutions for a meeting with the psychologist and restock on her meds. This happened twice every month, and the psychologist recommended for her to get an evaluation exam to determine her mental state. The hospital was a public one, and the wait for the exam was 3 months long unless she paid a hefty amount and you could schedule it within a week. Well, we didn't have the money, so we opted to wait. The day of the exam came, and she was staying at her house that time, so I messaged her, asking if she was at the hospital. She said she was and was doing okay, so it eased my worry. But she sent a picture of trees and nature in what seems to be an area. I asked her where she was, and she said she was at the hospital again, but elaborated a different kind of hospital. She was at the province at a house of a witch doctor who took her in. I was livid. Not because she was at a witch doctor, but because we waited months for the exam, and on the day itself, she chose to ditch it and lie to me about it. She said the witch doctor was helping her heal from her depression and anxiety, and that mostly of her anxiety was caused by, you guessed it, our maid. I didn't find it unbelievable, as our maid came from an area where the low-class lives that came from a provincial region where it was well known for witchcraft. And our maid even shouted threats at her at one point, where we were about to leave the house for the day, and suddenly, out of nowhere, started cursing at her. No triggers or anything. I told my mother everything before we went, and demanded she got fired by the time we come home. Later that day, I got a lot of calls and texts from our maid, begging me for forgiveness. Never forgave her, and to this day, we were at a Cold War situation. So yeah, I do believe that our maid was responsible for her anxiety because until now, I never saw her having a panic attack again, except for the general anxiety of a normal person. Elle said that the witch doctor advised her to never return to our area, as there were a lot of these black magic practitioners, and her curse would return. She took it to heart and never returned to our place, so I just went over to hers. Fine by me, as long as there's no more emergency calls. We haven't been back to the psychologist or bought meds anymore after healing either. One day though, Elle told us to go visit the witch doctor with her. So me, my cousin, Elle's friend who instructed her and introduced her to the witch doctor, his friend, Elle's brother and sister all packed in a car, went to this area for a visit. I thought it was just your typical witch doctor visit, though I have been to a few before where I would go with my grandfather and waited outside. But this time it was different. Much more different. We got there, a rural area with trees all over, with a few houses in between. It wasn't scary or creepy, just an average setting where you can see farm animals freely walking in a fenced property. The house was also normal, but not well paved, but more modern than bamboos and wood together. And the witch doctor was a nice person. I would not go into details about them, because it is against the rule to tell specifics, as there are a lot of bad persons, entities, and black witches who can go after them. Anyway, they just talked, but they were talking like they were possessed by another person or being. I forgot to say, but I am deadly afraid of witch doctors, or faith healers by the way, simply because of the fact that they are so real. So I just pretended to be okay and stood there, listening and watching the scene before me. Elle's sister and me occasionally glanced at each other to silently ask, "Do you believe them?" I gave her a shrug, as I do not want to disrespect any of them in their own territory. In the midst of their talk, they would casually bring up that they were hurting somewhere, and the witch doctor would do hand movements on that body part and pretend to stab something in the air, and the person said the pain was gone. I still stood there and pretended everything was normal, like the other in the room. Even if I wanted to leave the place, I couldn't, because we only had one ride and it was dark outside. I didn't know they were planning to stay the night. Then, the healing began. I forgot who the first to go, but everybody went through it, except my skeptic cousin. The witch doctor held a normal pen between your fingers, be it your toe or your hands, and circled it in the same spot, as they held the two fingers close with the pen in between. This was to cast the evil spirit out and reveal itself. I went out of the room because I was afraid that my energy or fear would make them fail the ritual, like how those who are afraid of the devil should leave the immediate area in case of a transfer possession. Suddenly, Elle told the witch doctor that I was possessed by something. Not possessed in an exorcist kind of way, but more like something is attached to me, and that I needed the help. Now I was shocked, because this wasn't part of the plan. It felt as a surprise healing, like the surprise overnight to that place. I felt like myself and wasn't depressed or anything, perfectly normal in my mind, so I'm not entirely sure why she thought I needed help. Was it my PTSD? It was very sudden, and I wasn't prepared. Let me clarify. I don't drink, smoke, or take drugs. None of us had a drink that night either, so everybody was sober. I didn't know what else to do but comply, lest they think that I'm actually possessed if I refuse the healing. That would make things worse. So I sat there, Doctor holding my foot with a pen between the big toe and the one next to it, holding it close around the pen. Elle held my right hand and they began to circle the pen. It hurts a lot, and the more they did it, the more it hurt, as actual blisters form on the skin around the pen. It was hell. I thrashed around and cried, trying to break free from the torture. Everyone in the room except Elle's sister held me down, on my legs, my arms and shoulders, as if I fought with all my strength. All while the doctor shouted questions at me, or wailed to tell the entity attached to me. This is where it gets hazy, as the pain was intolerable. They asked me questions like, "Who are you? What do you want with her? Why did you abuse her?" And to make it worse, I still don't feel different from my normal self. At this point, I prayed that whoever possessing me would actually take over and endure this if they were real. But there was none. It was only me and a bunch of people holding me down as the doctor continued the torture. To make it all stop, I answered with the first words that came to my mind as I shouted and cried. This seemed to make them calm down, and to my relief, the ritual eventually ended. Everybody drew a breath of relief as they cast the evil entity out, except for my cousin and Elle's sister. I later talked to her and found out that she felt the same, just answered all the same questions to get out of the situation. I think she also had a trauma about it, the same as I did. I had a big open blister between my toes, caused by the pen, and they left me alone after that. I avoided going back into the room and stayed around the living area until they decided to sleep in another room. I too went to sleep. In the morning, as I was anxious to go home, waiting outside the house for them was taking too long, and I eventually went inside the car to cry myself out. The shame and anger overtook me, and I bawled while they were taking their sweet time bidding farewell. The doctor's questions that night was really intrusive, and I basically shouted shameful words regarding the cause of my PTSD to everybody in the room, including the ones who didn't know about it. And no, it did not heal my PTSD. I still have it, and will probably for the rest of my life, and the experience didn't help me deal with it either. It just became another trauma. It was the most humiliating experience of my life so far. The only good thing about it was that Elle sort of found her peace in it, and helps her deal with day to day, and she's a better person now. They continue to remain in contact, but as for me, I do not want to go inside that house anymore, as they might conduct another healing ritual on me. I don't mind what her beliefs are, if they help her, but please, leave me out of it. I've been hearing a lot of knocking in the woods, close behind my house. It's very loud, and has a repeated pattering like as follows. 1 loud solid hit, 3 quick taps, then another loud solid hit. Both my father and I have heard this as we were just walking outside. The scary incidents have happened to me 3 different nights in the weeks prior. Tonight was the most scary, as I had had at least 3 around my house. I have been knocking back and whistling, to no avail, but sitting out on the back patio, I can hear the walking, limbs being broken as it walks. Then, everything is quiet, as if they have reached the edge of the wood line and are watching me. A few times I've sought to entertain them. I do silly stuff or whistle a tune. The night before, I was met with 3 limbs being cracked within 30 minutes. This was too frequent to be natural. I have tried to get a trail cam video, but no luck. The nights when I'm by myself, I can go out as per usual. They're already there and waiting on me. Tonight, I tried something different. I decided to just casually sit facing the woods and talk to them. I just say that I was their friend, and I meant no harm. As I talked, the woods lit up with noise. I was being approached from 3 different directions, but the largest one concerned me. I could hear limbs breaking as it got closer. I had a flashlight but was reluctant to shine it until I was freaked out. The thing was too close. I lit it up. What I could see appeared to be a very large animal, not quite to the edge, and colors making it almost indistinguishable from the woods. But the eyes, oh man, they shined a bright green. I would have thought it to be a critter, that only they were spaced 5 inches apart, and I could clearly make out the outline of something squatting, just staring right at me, not even blinking. This thing was huge. It nearly made me run just seeing it. I turned the light off and went the hell inside. I checked again an hour later and could still hear it walking around out there. This is something that has happened to me numerous times, and every time I'm alone, I can get a response from them. But if I have somebody with me and they do not show, they are definitely Bigfoots in Adele. And I have some that come to my backyard. There's only been one incident of the house being smacked during the night, and I've noticed that every night as they approach, all the neighborhood dogs go crazy. They can probably smell them. Now that I've seen them and know what to look for, I see and hear their presence all the time. This is definitely a hotbed. I just don't have the technology to show you definitive proof. At the time I first encountered them, I was shocked to find the eye shine coming from ground level. It was bad weather that night, and poor visibility. I thought it was a small animal, but decided to video it anyway, because I was seeing a face. When I walked closer, I could tell it was a Bigfoot lying flat on the ground, watching me through the shrubs. I still have that video. The environment around me is a small creek running next to my house. Several acres of forest behind the house. It's part pine forest. There's a large pond way back there off of our property, and as it gets closer to my house, it turns into thick spots of oak, pine, and several types of small foliage. There's a very dense deer population in this specific location also. Each time I've had the Bigfoot approach the house, they are coming in on one of 2 trails which we have leading out into the woods. They're coming from far back near where the pond is, I imagine. This is something that happened a long time ago, and to be honest, I never thought it could be connected to a Sasquatch or Bigfoot. But recently, I've been reading a lot about the topic, and I figured I'd send it to you guys after finding your website and just checking out reports from areas where I've lived in the past. Anyway, I found a report from Belchertown, Massachusetts, and I lived in a rural part for several years when I was in college. This was sometime around 1997 to 1998. My housemates and I were out on our porch, which faced 2 to 3 acres of meadow. This open meadow and the porch were on the east side of the house. The entire area past the meadow to the east was wooded with houses and cabins, here and there, for about a mile, until you hit a lake. Behind the house was about 10 to 20 yards of woods, with a walking trail, and then another 10 yards past was train tracks running east to west, then more woods. Anyway, my housemates and I were out on the porch when we heard the sound of a tree crashing to the ground. About 19 seconds later, while we were all kind of shocked, there was an enormously loud and guttural growl, scream, roar, whatever you want to call it. In all my life, I have never heard any animal sound that could match its intensity, volume. It just sounded plain angry and vivacious. It is hard to describe just how loud it was and how stunned we all were that this was coming from an animal just inside the tree line. There were coyotes, owls, foxes galore back then, and the sounds they made were a world away in comparison. We all immediately looked at each other, got up, and went into the house as fast as we could, without muttering a word. Everyone assumed it was an animal, but after reading about and hearing recordings of presumed Sasquatch screams and howls, it brought the memory rushing back, because it is so similar to what we heard. Anyway, just wanted to share this with you. In the years of 2015 to 2016, I had encounters with a creature in the Mississippi River bottoms at a place called Drinkwater, a flood-controlled pump station on the Mississippi levee system east of Charleston, Missouri. The first encounter consisted of hearing high-pitched, long drawn-out echoing of the concrete walls of the pump station. The sounds were far from off, so I paid them no mind at the time, but I did find them to be quite odd. The second encounter happened just a few months later, as a few friends and I were bow fishing one night. We were down by the lock gate, shooting fish, when I happened to look up at the levee to our right, and noticed something standing on the levee watching us about 200 or so yards off. Even though it was dark, you could see the outline of the figure standing upright in the faint light, caused by a semi-truck weight station on the highway that crossed over to Illinois. It didn't stay long, but it left an eerie feeling over us at the time. We left shortly afterwards. The third encounter was the most interesting one of all. One of my friends and I were bow fishing again, and one night at the pump station, when we began hearing the high-pitched sounds again. My friend, who was holding up a spotlight so that I could see to shoot, began to go into a panic and started shining the light in the woods to our right, which irritated me at this time because I couldn't see the fish without the light. While trying to calm him down to get the light back to the water, something grunted off to our left. At 25 yards or so stood a creature of a height between 8 and 9 feet tall, covered in dark brown to black hair at the very edge of the tree line in full view of the spotlight. The creature watched us for a little under a minute time, with one arm gripping a tree limb the size of my forearm, as if he were using it to keep his balance. When the creature departed, he let out several loud grunts and at a steady walking pace left the scene while breaking any tree limb in its path, whether it was dead or green. We left after the encounter, terrified at what we had just witnessed. The past several months, we have had some very strange activity going on around our house. We live out in the country, and we've ignored a lot of it. But here lately, we can't ignore the activity going on. About a month or two ago, my husband went outside to smoke, and he heard something as he looked into our driveway, and we seen an animal that stood about 7 feet tall, all hairy. He couldn't explain it, except that it looked like one of our dogs on 2 feet, and extremely tall. It walked past our trailer, and that's how he could guess the height. We've heard what sounded like a baseball bat hitting a tree. We've heard whistles and calls of what a Bigfoot sounds like. We've had chickens and cats go missing. Every night, about the same time, you can hear footsteps and sounds. It's to the point where we were so scared to go outside. We've never believed in Bigfoot till we've seen it and have heard them. I'm sure there are more than one around here, because we live near caves and they sound like they are all around us at the nighttime. We had a ball in our yard, and after finding it in the woods one day and down the road from us another day and brought it back several times, it went missing and we've not been able to find it. I just find it odd that this has just happened just after we've been hearing the noises that sound like a Bigfoot. I worked on a dairy farm between Deersville and Tippecanoe, Ohio, and Harrison County during high school. It was March 1982, about 5 o'clock in the morning. There was a heavy frost on the ground, a full moon, and I could see fairly clearly due to the moonlight. I went to the outside paddock area to feed the replacement dairy heifer and started dumping the grain attached to the board fence when I heard a low grunt. The kind of grunt that someone makes from being in one position too long as you stand up. When I looked up, this figure was in the process of standing up. It was on the other side of a small creek that ran through the paddock, approximately 50 yards away. The figure was standing next to the wooden hay feeder. It stood there for a few seconds and then walked towards the other end of the pen, closest to the woods. I only saw it for about 5 to 10 seconds, but could hear it walking for approximately 45 seconds. I heard the sounds of footsteps crunching in the frost as it moved to the other end of the pen, and then heard the squeaking sound of the fence being pushed down. The cattle, somehow, were not spooked at all during this encounter and just continued to eat. After we were finished milking, I went over to the hay feeder and couldn't find any prints in the ground as the frost was gone. The figure appeared to be 7 feet tall, which I estimated was a foot taller than I. I have hunted and farmed the area for years. My parents' farm is approximately 5 miles from where my incident took place. I have 2 other possible incidents, all while bow hunting. The first occurred while I was hunting from a tree stand in a hayfield back in 2010. It was the end of October, or first part of November, and it was right at dusk. I watched 3 does enter the hayfield and start to eat the grass. After approximately 2 to 3 minutes, I heard a scream that I can't explain. The 3 does immediately ran off through the hayfield and into the woods. While still in my tree stand, whatever it was that kept screaming for 15 minutes, it caused me to leave the area. The second incident was in 2011, during bow season, while hunting the same place with my teenage son. While using a doe call, I heard something walk down over the hill through the trees. I watched and listened for a few minutes and can hear the sound of something urinating. Whatever it was did not move again. When it was too dark to hunt, we left the area. This story might be too fantastic to believe, but I promise it happened. It was the last 3 months of '99, and my first marriage had just ended. When we began discussions, I agreed to let my ex continue to live in our house with the children. As a result, we thrust onto the market for a new home. For the time being, I was crashing in an extended stay hotel and living on fast food. Finally, as that spring approached, I found a place that I loved. The only disappointing part of the deal was that it had to have been uninhabited for going on 7 years. The woman that had lived there before had died, and her heirs had let it sit empty. It was eventually agreed to put it on the market, and that's when I came upon it. Despite the probable long list of repairs, the price was just too good to pass up. The morning of March 3rd, I picked up the keys and signed the papers. The house was officially mine, and I got to work immediately to make it livable. I replaced a broken window and a few other things before I moved in 2 weeks later. I hadn't been there 2 days before I received a visit from a pair of detectives. They sat me down and told me the craziest thing I'd heard in my life. According to them, the nice little old lady who had lived there, Sharon, had a very abusive husband named Walter. She claimed Walter left for the store one morning and never returned. Because of his history of abuse, she didn't report his disappearance. The couple's only child, Melinda, did not either. Her mother had told Walter that he had been having an affair with a woman from his job and had likely ran away to be with her. Melinda took her mother's story at face value, and the woman bid Walter good riddance and moved on with their lives. Within the year, Sharon, now a free woman, began a relationship with her neighbor, Joseph Poole. She was granted a divorce, and the couple were married not long after. The pair lived out their lives in this house. Not everyone was so eager to believe Sharon's story, and the police were asked by Walter's sister to investigate his disappearance. Year after year, the trail always led back to Sharon, but the detectives on the case never had enough proof to arrest her. Then, about 15 years after he went missing, a new pair of detectives were put on the trail. They went back to Walter's sister, now a very old woman, and asked if she had any idea how Sharon could have disposed of her brother's body. For the first time since the case began, she recalled an incident that took place not long after Walter's disappearance. She was visiting Sharon, hoping to get some information as to where her brother had moved to, and she happened to notice a large patch of the backyard where the ground had been tilled up and roses had been planted. This struck her as odd because it was still in the middle of winter and at least 4 months before planting season began. I'm sure you know where this is going. The bushes would surely die in the brutal Michigan winter. She asked Sharon about this, and she simply said that she wanted to get ahead of things. The sister had no reason to disbelieve her at the time and accepted the story. For the first time in a long time, the police actually had a direction to follow. However, they were frustrated by the judge's denial of a search warrant, and the case soon ran out of steam, as it had so many times before. Life would then proceed, and over the years, the case would be forgotten. That was until a new police chief was hired, and he launched an initiative to clear the city's open cases. My visitors were assigned the case, and after a little research, they discovered Sharon and her new husband had died, and the house had a new owner. The reason for their visit was to ask if I would allow them to dig up the yard to look for Walter's remains. I was naturally shocked by all of it, and I needed time to think about it. After taking a few days to consider the request, I gave them the okay. The following morning, 20 or so cops, accompanied by a backhoe, began their search. I want to say I was surprised by what they found, but after hearing their story, Walter's skeleton being discovered was almost expected. At the end of the day, everything seemed to work out for the best. The cops managed to close a 50-year-old mystery, and Walter got to be put away alongside his loved ones. The only downside was Walter's sister didn't live to see it. She deserved to be there for the funeral after all the time she put into the search for him. This situation has made me do a lot more thinking since it was brought to my attention. From all reports, old Walter was not good to his wife or the respected marriage. Maybe Sharon had a good reason to put an end to his crap. The problem I have with what she did is that by killing Walter and hiding his body away in the garden, his innocent sister, who had hurt nobody, was left with the terrible notion that she and the rest of his family had been abandoned by him for a young piece of tail. Then, as time carried on, she had come to terms with the strong possibility that her brother was indeed dead. She had nowhere to go to mourn him, and that, my friends, is just not right. I was on my postal route one morning when I got the idea. A small part of my route cuts through this old, abandoned neighborhood. At the end of a cul-de-sac sits this decrepit 2-story house, something like you'd see in an old horror movie. This is where I was going to do it. You see, I have this friend, Philip. We are part of a ghost hunting group in our spare time. It's a pastime I really enjoy and derive a lot of excitement from. Philip, however, is terrified of anything supernatural. Something as average as a cheesy ghost video on YouTube scares the crap out of him. I'll never understand why he puts himself through one of our investigations. I asked him once why he did it, and he said it was his way to face his fears, something he'd heard about on TV. This put the kernel of an idea in my head. When I saw the house, it grew into a full-blown plan. I was going to pull a joke on Philip. When it was over, hopefully his fear of spooky things would be defeated. Anytime I can get a good laugh and help a friend at the same time seemed like a win-win to me. I called him up at the afternoon and told him we had a new house to investigate that Friday night. He sounded excited, and I couldn't help but laugh, knowing just what I had in mind for him. I had 2 days to get what I needed and set everything up. I'd stop in during my route and look for the best places to rig my equipment. There were signs of people, but from all I could see, they had not been around for a long time. Finally, Friday night came. After work, I parked my car a few streets over and walked over to the house. I wasn't expecting Phil for another hour. I took this time to complete any last-minute tasks. I got done with 15 minutes to spare and crawled into my hiding place. Within minutes, I heard footsteps approaching outside. I bit my lip to stifle my giggling. I'd never felt so much like a child at that moment. Mere seconds after I heard the footsteps, my phone vibrated with a text message. It was Philip. He said he was held up by a train near his apartment and was running late. This was bad news. Phil lived almost 30 minutes away. I'd have to lay crunched up in my hidey hole even longer. The steps entered the house, echoing down the massive hallway. Wait a minute. This is when it hit me. If Philip was a half hour away, who was here? Voices of at least 2 men came bouncing down the hall toward me. One man had noticed my equipment and sounded very angry. I heard loud bangs a few seconds later, from what I can assume was my stuff being smashed. The second man had a slight slur to his voice, and his words were far more aggressive. If I find out who did this crap, I'm gonna cut his head off and put it on a pole outside. Maybe that will keep people out. My heart began beating like it was trying to break loose from my body. I wasn't sure what they were capable of, and hoped they would leave without realizing that I was still there. I did my best to not make any noise. I continued to listen, and then I heard something dreaded. One of the men, the drunk one, found my bag. I had stuck it in a hole under the stairs to hide it. Even then, I wasn't sure they knew I was still there, at least until the other man began calling for me to come out. He said if I made them look, they were going to make me sorry when they found me. All doubt was removed from that statement. I could hear them going from room to room, opening closets and doors. They were a few rooms away, and I decided I need to get the hell out of there, that second. When I heard them enter the room next to me, I made a break for it. I didn't dare look back, and within seconds, I could hear footfalls behind me. So I pushed myself even harder. It seemed to work. The closer I got to my car, the footfalls seemed to grow quieter. Still, even then, I didn't dare slow down. I ran around to the driver's side of my car and unlocked the door as fast as I could. This was my first look at my two pursuers. I was pleased to see them almost 100 yards behind me. They were gasping and fighting for every breath. I wasn't taking any chances though. I started my car and tore out of there without looking back ever again. That is when I remembered Philip was on his way. I made up some quick BS text and sent it to him. I did so just in time. I was 4 or 5 blocks from the house when we met each other across the intersection. He pulled up to me, and I began spinning some yarn about a wrong address. He must have believed it. He shrugged his shoulders, turned around, and headed for home. I followed him for about a mile just to make sure they turned off from my own place. To my knowledge, Philip still has no idea how close he was to being assaulted by an angry pair of squatters. The same likely applies to the practical joke I was planning. After my run-in with them, things got put into perspective. I realized the joke was a childish thing to do in the first place. I've put stupid stuff like that behind me now. I'm in no position to tell folks how to live their lives. If he wants to live in fear, that's his choice. God knows there's plenty of things out there to be afraid of.